Get comfortable. If you have a blanket nearby, pull it a little closer. If the light in the room is too bright, you can dim it now or just close your eyes and let my voice paint the picture for you. There is no rush tonight. Nowhere you need to be. Nothing you need to do except settle in and let your mind travel somewhere familiar. Tonight we are going back to Springfield. Not the Springfield you think you already know from 36 years of watching. Not the show with the yellow family and the donut gags and the couch that gets different every single week. We are going to the Springfield that exists underneath the one on the surface. The one that the show has been constructing quietly, methodically, and with surprising patience for decades. Buried in background details. Hidden in throwaway lines that most people hear once and forget. Encoded in continuity patterns that only become visible when you step back far enough to see the full shape they form. Because there are people who have been stepping back and looking. Fans who have spent years connecting threads across hundreds of episodes. Critics who have noticed patterns that the show itself never openly acknowledges. Theorists who have built frameworks so internally consistent that the writers of the show have been compelled to respond to them directly, which is itself a remarkable thing when you think about it. You do not publicly address a theory unless it has gotten close enough to something to make you feel the need. What these people have found, when they pull the threads loose and follow them where they go, is a version of Springfield that is stranger and darker and considerably more melancholy than the one the show presents on its surface. A town that makes a kind of terrible sense once you understand the systems running underneath it. A family whose dysfunction traces back to causes that are specific and real within the show's logic, not just cartoon comedy. A set of mysteries so carefully constructed that 36 years of close watching has not resolved them. And tonight, we are going to go through all of it. Every major theory, every piece of supporting evidence, every counter-argument, and every place where the evidence exceeds what the counter-arguments can absorb. We are going to take it slowly and thoroughly and at a pace that is designed for listening in the dark with your eyes closed. So take a breath. Let your body settle into wherever you are right now. Let your shoulders drop. Let the thoughts from earlier in the day begin to quiet down. Springfield is waiting. Section 1. The nuclear power plant and what it did to Springfield. There is a structure on the edge of Springfield that has been there since the very beginning. 2 cooling towers, wide and heavy at their base, tapering upward, releasing their columns of steam into the sky above the town at all hours without interruption. From certain angles, in certain episodes, you can see them from the elementary school. You can see them from the baseball diamond. You can pick them out from the hill near the Simpsons house on a clear day, depending on which way the camera is pointing. They are the most consistently visible landmark in Springfield, and they belong to the most powerful man in it, the Springfield Nuclear Power Plant, a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility, owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, the source of the town's electricity and a great deal of its economic activity, and also, according to the theory that the show has been quietly building for 3.5 decades, the source of something else entirely. Something that has changed every living thing in Springfield in ways that nobody who lives there has ever fully reckoned with. Let us start with the violations, because the violations are where the theory gets its foundation. During a safety inspection that the show depicts in detail, inspectors documented 342 separate violations at the plant. Not minor paperwork issues. Not technical bureaucratic infractions that amount to a fine and a filing deadline. 342 failures of safety protocol at an active nuclear facility in the middle of a populated town, each one representing a specific way in which the plant was not doing what it was supposed to do to protect the people around it. The estimated cost to bring the plant into compliance with basic regulatory standards was $56 million. Burns refused to pay it. And this is the detail worth pausing on, because the show makes clear that the money was not the issue. Burns is a billionaire. He has been a billionaire for a very long time, long enough that the specific dollar amount required to fix his plant's violations is not a significant figure in the context of his holdings. He refused, not for financial reasons but for strategic ones. Acknowledging the violations as fixable problems meant acknowledging they were violations in the first place. Acknowledging they were violations meant someone might start asking what those violations had already done. And that question, the question of what those violations had already done to the population living downwind of those cracked cooling towers, is the question Burns has spent decades ensuring nobody asks The specific violations the show has documented over the years are worth laying out carefully, because taken individually, each one sounds like the kind of reckless absurdity the show trades in for comedy. But taken together, as a documented record of what has been happening inside and around an active nuclear facility, they describe something considerably more serious. Radioactive waste has been dumped directly into bodies of water near the plant. Radioactive waste has been left on children's playgrounds, which means children have been playing in proximity to nuclear material without anyone warning them or their parents. Plutonium, an element that is among the most radioactively toxic substances in existence, has been used as a paperweight on someone's desk inside the facility. The cooling towers, the structures whose entire function is to manage the thermal output of the reactor in ways that prevent dangerous releases of heat and radiation, have cracks in them that were patched with chewing gum. Not repaired, patched with gum. Glowing rats have been found living inside the facility, not dead rats near a radiation source. Living rats whose biology had been altered by their exposure to whatever they were feeding on in the walls and tunnels of that building, altered enough that their bodies produced visible light. And then there is the detail that the show drops once, in a way that is easy to miss if you are watching casually, and never returns to human skeletons in the basement. Bones. In the basement of an active nuclear power plant. Not in a historical context, not as an archaeological discovery from an earlier era of the building's life. Skeletons in a basement, at a place where a person should have to explain how they got there before anyone agrees to move on. The show does not explain it. It does not attempt to explain it. It shows the skeletons, treats them as an item on the inspection report, and continues. Nobody asks who those people were. Nobody asks how they ended up dead inside a working facility. Nobody calls anyone about it. In Springfield, even the bodies in the basement are unremarkable. Now consider who is standing between this facility and the town around it. Homer Simpson, safety inspector at the Springfield nuclear power plant. His job, the entire function he is paid to perform, is to be the person who ensures that a facility capable of catastrophic environmental harm remains within the bounds of what is safe for the surrounding population. The show's creator, Matt Groening, has stated in interviews that Homer's IQ is 55. In a later episode, when Homer has a crayon removed from his brain and his measured intelligence rises dramatically, the implication is clear that without the crayon, his intelligence would be somewhere in a profoundly impaired range. He has been sleeping at his workstation since the first season of the show. He eats donuts during meltdown warnings. He has caused multiple nuclear incidents through negligence and curiosity and a general inability to predict the consequences of his actions beyond the immediate moment. In one episode, Homer causes a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core to see if it would grow bigger inside the intense heat and radiation of an active nuclear reaction. He simply wanted to see what would happen. That is the man whose specific function is to prevent catastrophic nuclear events at a facility with 342 documented safety violations. And he has been performing that function, or failing to perform it, for over 30 years. When German investors briefly purchased the plant in one episode, the very first thing they did upon taking ownership was terminate Homer's employment. The second thing they did was commission a full assessment of what it would cost to bring the plant into compliance with safety standards. The number they received nearly drove them to bankruptcy. They sold the plant back to Burns as quickly as they could, and Burns immediately rehired Homer. The sequence is worth holding on to. The moment someone who was not invested in the plant's ongoing violations took control, they fired the person who was enabling those violations. The moment Burns got the plant back, he returned that person to his original position. A competent safety inspector would shut the plant down within a week. Homer ensures the violations continue. His incompetence is not a liability to Burns. It is an asset. The first visible biological evidence that the plant is affecting the organisms around it appears in the show's second season. A three-eyed fish is pulled from a river near the power plant. The fish, which the show names Blinky, becomes significant enough within the episode to drive a gubernatorial campaign. A candidate uses Blinky as the centerpiece of a platform, arguing that Burns is poisoning Springfield's natural environment. The mutation is specific, verifiable, and tied directly to the proximity of a nuclear facility that has been documented dumping radioactive waste into nearby bodies of water. Burns is forced to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate its safety. The moment passes. The town moves on. Nobody tests the water. Nobody commissions a study of what the plant's runoff has done to the river ecosystem. Nobody looks at a three-eyed fish that was pulled from a river downstream of a nuclear facility and asks the question that follows logically from that image. If the fish have three eyes, what is happening to the people drinking the same water? The show does not answer this question directly, but it has been answering it indirectly across 3.5 decades of episodes in the most visible possible way. The answer has been on screen in every frame since the first season. Look at the residents. Homer has a skull shape that does not correspond to any human anatomy. His overbite is extreme. His eyes protrude from his head in a way that is not a stylistic exaggeration of normal human proportions but a distinct structural difference. He has 4 fingers on each hand. His cognitive function, as we have established, is profoundly impaired. And his capacity to absorb physical damage and continue functioning is something that the show treats as comedy but which, examined seriously, describes a body that has been fundamentally altered in ways that make it more durable than a normal human body. Homer has been shot, he has been electrocuted, he has fallen from buildings and cliffs and significant heights, he has been struck by vehicles, he has survived explosions at ranges that should be fatal. He has walked away from every single one of these events without lasting physical consequences. His healing rate is not within the normal human range. His tolerance for physical trauma is not human in any recognizable sense. Marge has the same bulging eyes, the same 4 fingers. She has been maintaining the exact same tower of blue hair, growing straight upward in apparent defiance of every law of physics and biology that governs how human hair behaves for 36 years. It has never changed shape. It has never required any visible maintenance. It simply exists in the same form it has always been in, every episode, every season, without any explanation for how this is possible. The children, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie, were all born in Springfield to parents who had already been living in Springfield's environment for years before any of them arrived. All 3 display the same physical characteristics: the protruding eyes, the disproportionate skull shapes, the 4 fingers, the yellow skin that covers every resident of Springfield and literally no one from outside it. They were conceived and born and raised in this environment. Their biology has been shaped by it from before their births. The yellow skin is worth dwelling on, because it is the detail that makes the theory click for people who take it seriously. Yellow skin is a symptom. It can indicate liver dysfunction in real medical contexts. It can indicate conditions that affect how the body processes certain substances. When every single resident of a town displays a distinctive skin tone that appears in no population anywhere else in the world, the most basic epidemiological question is why? What do these people have in common that produces this specific observable characteristic in all of them? The answer that the radiation theory proposes is that they have the same water supply, the same air, and the same nuclear facility upstream of both. Now, here is the detail that makes the whole framework cohere. When characters from outside Springfield visit the town in the show, they do not look like Springfield residents. Their proportions are more natural. Their eyes are less extreme. Their features more closely resemble what we recognize as standard human anatomy. They are visibly different from the people who live in Springfield, even when they are standing in the same frame. The explanation that casual viewers reach for is that this is a stylistic choice. Springfield residents look the way they do because of the show's visual language, and outsiders are drawn differently to visually distinguish them from the established cast. But that explanation does not hold up, because the distinction is not just between named characters and background extras, or between recurring characters and one-time visitors. The distinction is between people who live in Springfield and people who come from outside it. People from outside the town look like something closer to recognizable human beings. People from inside it look like they have been altered, which is exactly what the theory predicts. The same pattern applies to the animals. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same disproportionate eyes as his owners. He was acquired as a puppy in Springfield and has lived in Springfield his entire life. The proportional differences that mark the Simpsons as physically different from outside visitors are present in the family pet. Blinky the fish has 3 eyes from living in the river that receives the plant's runoff. The wildlife of Springfield is visibly altered by the environment, and the show acknowledges this directly by treating Blinky as evidence of environmental contamination. Then it asks the audience to accept that the same contamination affecting fish and dogs has somehow produced no effects in the humans who have been living in closer proximity to it for longer. Burns himself is the most important piece of the puzzle, and his relevance to the radiation theory goes far beyond simply being the man who owns the plant. In the episode known as the Springfield Files, which is built around a parody of the X-Files television series, Homer encounters something in the woods near Springfield that he believes is an alien being. The town panics. The episode builds its mystery carefully over its runtime, and the resolution, the reveal of what Homer actually saw, is one of the most quietly significant moments in the show's long history of casually significant moments. What Homer saw was Mr. Burns. Burns has been undergoing weekly medical treatments at a facility that the show does not fully describe. The treatments involve a combination of chemicals and radiation therapy, so extreme, so intensive, that after each session, Burns's body produces a visible green glow. His tissues are saturated with radioactive and chemical compounds to such a degree that he emits visible light. The treatment is what keeps him alive. Without it, he would not survive the week. Not survive in the sense of feeling unwell or declining in health, but survive in the sense that his biological functions would cease within 7 days of a missed dose. After each session, in the hours following the treatment, Burns walks out of the facility in a state of dazed chemical euphoria, stumbling through the woods in the dark, glowing. Homer saw this and concluded he was seeing an extraterrestrial, because the figure he observed was humanoid but luminous and moving in an uncoordinated way through the trees at night. The town heard Homer's account, believed him, brought FBI investigators to Springfield, and built an entire public event around the possibility of alien contact. The actual explanation, a man whose body has been so thoroughly saturated with radioactive material that it emits light, was not what anyone considered. Burns is the person in Springfield who is most visibly and most extremely altered by nuclear material. And when the evidence of that alteration is directly in front of the town, the collective response is to assume it must be from another planet. That is how thoroughly the residents of Springfield have normalized their environment. A glowing man walking through the woods is more easily categorized as alien life than as what happens to a human body after prolonged and extreme nuclear exposure. Burns understands what the plant is doing to Springfield. He has always understood it. He understands it because he is the most extreme example of it. His body has been so fundamentally altered by decades of proximity to nuclear material that it can no longer sustain itself through biological processes that do not involve external radiation input. He is, in the most literal possible sense, a person whose biology has been remade by nuclear exposure. He knows what radiation does to biological systems. He is currently managing what radiation does to biological systems in his own body, every week, on a precise schedule, with the resources of a billionaire dedicated to the task. And he knows what the plant's uncontrolled radiation, its dumped waste, its cracked towers, its 342 violations, has been doing to the bodies and the brains of the people who have been living in its shadow without the resources to manage it, without the knowledge that management is even necessary, without the private physicians and the pharmaceutical division, and the weekly treatments that allow Burns to function while his exposure continues. Springfield is his laboratory. That is the framework the theory proposes, and the show supports it. The people of Springfield are the control group. They receive the unmanaged exposure, and what happens to them over time is what unmanaged, long-term, low-level radiation exposure does to a human population. The results are visible in every frame. The Simpsons movie provides what may be the most direct confirmation the show has ever offered, that Springfield's environmental contamination is real and serious within the show's own logic. In the film, the contamination reaches a point severe enough that the Environmental Protection Agency, operating as a functioning federal agency within the show's universe, determines that the entire town must be physically sealed, not remediated, not regulated more strictly, sealed under a massive glass dome to prevent the contamination from spreading to the surrounding environment. The United States government, looking at Springfield and assessing its condition, concluded that the only viable response was containment. The entire town was classified as a contamination zone so dangerous that the contamination must be prevented from reaching the rest of the country. And every person who had been living inside Springfield, drinking from the same water supply as the three-eyed fish, breathing the same air that flows past the cracked cooling towers, was inside the dome when it went up. Now, there is a thread within the radiation theory that concerns Homer's intelligence in a way that goes beyond his baseline cognitive impairment. In the 12th season, an episode reveals that Homer has a crayon lodged in his brain. It has been there since childhood, physically inside his skull, pressing against brain tissue, reducing his cognitive function in measurable ways that have shaped the entirety of his adult life. The episode then does something extraordinary. Homer has the crayon removed, and what emerges from that removal is a version of Homer that is genuinely different from the one the show has depicted across its entire run. He becomes articulate and analytical. He is capable of sustained logical reasoning. He can see the systems around him with a clarity that had never been available to him before. He can understand the architecture of his own life, his job, his town, his circumstances, in ways that the fog of impairment had always prevented. And it makes him deeply, quietly miserable. He looks at Springfield with clear eyes for the first time and finds it unbearable. The plant, the violations, the town's apparent inability to see what is happening to it. His own role as the person whose incompetence enables the ongoing contamination. He sees it all. He understands it. And the weight of that understanding is more than he can sustain. So he has the crayon put back, voluntarily. He chooses cognitive impairment over clarity, because clarity in Springfield is a form of suffering the fog was protecting him from. That choice is heartbreaking in its own right, but the episode raises a question it never answers. How did a crayon get inside a child's brain without anyone noticing? Homer grew up in Springfield. He visited Springfield doctors. He received whatever healthcare Springfield provided across his entire childhood and adolescence and adult life. Not one medical professional in Springfield, across decades of contact with a patient who had a foreign object in his skull, ever found it. Either the medical establishment in Springfield is comprehensively incompetent, or something else is happening. Either the doctors are genuinely failing to notice, which strains belief when a simple imaging scan would reveal the problem, or they are choosing not to look, or looking and choosing not to say. If Burns's influence extends into Springfield's healthcare infrastructure, if the physicians operating in a town that belongs economically to Burns have been conditioned to overlook evidence of what the plant has done to their patients, then Homer's crayon is not just a personal tragedy. It is evidence of a systematic suppression of medical information. The kind of suppression that would be necessary if a billionaire wanted to prevent a population from learning what his facility had been doing to their brains. The radiation theory explains the aging problem, which we will return to in more detail later. It explains the physical characteristics of Springfield's residents. It explains Homer's resilience and his impairment as two faces of the same environmental alteration. It explains Burns's impossible survival as the consequence of having the resources to manage his own radiation exposure in ways no one else in town can access. It explains the animals. It explains the outsiders who look different from the residents. It explains everything through a single mechanism: the cracked cooling towers and what they have been releasing into the air and water for 36 years. Springfield is not a quirky cartoon town. Springfield is a contamination zone, and the plant that dominates its skyline is not a background element or a recurring visual gag. It is the cause of everything you see. Every yellow face, every four-fingered hand, every impossible recovery, every reset, and every forgotten catastrophe, and every moment of collective denial. The plant is not part of the show. The plant is the show. It has always been the show. The writers have been telling you this consistently and repeatedly since the very first episode aired. They have simply been telling you in a register that makes it easy to laugh and move on without fully registering what you heard. Take a long, slow breath. Let the cooling towers stand in the background of whatever you are imagining. We are just beginning. And before we go any further, pause here for a moment. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. Whether it is late at night or early in the morning, whether you are in a bedroom or on a couch or somewhere else entirely, I want to know where Springfield is finding you. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is a good moment to do that. We are going to be here for a long time tonight, and I want you to come back. Let us keep going. Section 2. The Homer Coma Theory. The 1st of April, 1993. The date matters. Remember it, because everything that follows, in this theory's framework, is downstream of what happened on that date. It was the 18th episode of the show's 4th season, an episode called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise began simply. Bart played a series of April Fool's pranks on Homer, each one escalating past the last, until the final prank involved taking one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and placing it inside an industrial paint shaker. When Homer opened the can, the explosion sent him to the hospital. While Homer was recovering in his hospital bed, he saw a vending machine across the room. He wanted a candy bar. He reached for it. The machine tipped forward under his weight and fell on him. Homer Simpson flatlined. He entered a clinical coma that lasted, within the show's timeline, for 7 weeks. This is not described as a dream sequence. The show does not present it as a vision, or an aside, or a moment of Homer's imagination. It is a real event within the canon of the series. Homer Simpson was in a coma, and the episode ended with what appeared to be him waking up. Bart confessed tearfully at his bedside. Homer sprang awake and reached for Bart's throat in the show's characteristic gesture. Everyone laughed. Crisis resolved. Normal resumed. Except the episode also disclosed, in its final moments, that Homer had lost 5% of his brain function during the coma, permanently. 5% of his cognitive capacity, gone and not coming back. And Homer's response to being told he has suffered irreversible brain damage is to laugh, while also noting that he does not understand why he is laughing. The family finds this charming. The show ends. The next episode begins. 32 more years of the series follow without anyone mentioning what happened in that hospital room ever again. Unless Homer never left the hospital. That is the premise of the Homer coma theory. It was originally developed on Reddit by a user called Hard Topic A Name, and it has become the most broadly discussed, most carefully argued, and most emotionally resonant fan theory in the long history of this show. The theory is simple in its structure and vast in its implications. Homer did not wake up from his coma in April 1993. Every episode since then, every storyline, every character development, every celebrity appearance, every impossible event, every world-altering disaster that everyone forgets about by the following week, all of it is a dream. It is the extended dream of a man lying in Springfield General Hospital, losing function slowly, while his family sits beside him in a room that the camera has never shown us. Let us build the case methodically, because the evidence is more substantial than most dismissals of the theory acknowledge. The most important evidence is tonal, and it is the kind of evidence that is easy to explain away individually, but that becomes significant when you treat it as a pattern. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a show with its feet on the ground. Not realistic in the way a drama is realistic, it was always a cartoon with a heightened and satirical relationship to the world it depicted. But its stories were anchored in recognizable human situations. Homer trying to stop drinking and failing, Marge questioning whether she is still the person she wants to be inside the life she has constructed, Lisa developing a crush on a substitute teacher who represents the kind of intellectual engagement her school normally fails to offer, Bart facing the prospect of being held back a year and having to confront what that means for his sense of himself. These are stories about pressure and aspiration and the ordinary failures of ordinary people trying to live decent lives in a town that does not always make that easy. They are funny because the show is a comedy, but the emotional material they are built on is recognizable. Financial stress, marital tension, children who struggle, parents who try and fall short, the specific texture of working-class family life in America. After the coma, all of that changes. Homer goes to space. This is not presented as a fantasy sequence. Within the show's canon, Homer Simpson became a NASA astronaut and traveled to the International Space Station with a mission crew that included Buzz Aldrin. Homer travels to dozens of foreign countries across later seasons. He joins a secret society that is clearly analogous to the Freemasons and participates in its rituals. He is briefly the leader of a vigilante crime-fighting group. He discovers that his mother, whom he believed was dead, has been living underground for 27 years as a fugitive radical. He meets God on 2 separate occasions and has substantive conversations with the divine. He befriends celebrities. He holds, by the count of a devoted fan community, somewhere between 40 and 100 distinct jobs across the later seasons. He survives physical events that would kill a normal person dozens of times over. The escalation from the grounded domestic comedy of the early seasons to the increasingly fantastical adventures of the later ones is something the show's audience has been discussing and debating for as long as the later seasons have existed. The question of when The Simpsons changed, or declined, or shifted its priorities in ways that some viewers found disappointing has been a recurring conversation in the fan community for over 20 years. The coma theory proposes that this conversation has been asking the wrong question. The show did not change because the writers changed. The show changed because the dream changed. The early coma dreams are heavily influenced by actual memory and produce stories that feel relatively grounded in recognizable experience. As the dreaming brain loses function over time, as the synaptic connections begin to deteriorate and the electrical patterns become less organized, the dreams become more disconnected from consensus reality, more reliant on fragments and emotional impressions than on coherent narrative architecture. The progression of the show across its seasons maps onto this trajectory with uncomfortable precision. There is a specific piece of evidence that the coma theory reaches back to retrieve, and it is the piece that stays with people longest after they first encounter the theory. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere, Homer had a conversation with God. The episode was called Homer the Heretic. Homer skipped church on a Sunday and had an extraordinarily peaceful day at home alone. He felt more content than he could remember feeling in a long time. And eventually he fell asleep and had a dream in which God appeared to him and they spoke directly. In that conversation, God told Homer that Homer would learn the meaning of life. But not yet. Not yet was what God said. Homer's time was coming, but it had not arrived. 6 months later, a vending machine fell on Homer and put him in a coma. The theory reads that exchange as a prophecy that the show embedded in its own structure, either deliberately or through the kind of serendipitous narrative coherence that sometimes emerges from a long creative work when you examine it from the right angle. God in the season 4 premiere was telling Homer that his conscious life was approaching its end, not his time to learn the meaning of life in any abstract spiritual sense, but his time to cease waking experience. His time to enter the dream that would become 32 more years of episodes. The timing is specific, the language is suggestive, and the coma that follows 6 months later, the event that the theory identifies as the hinge point of the entire series, arrives exactly when God's comment suggested it would. Now consider the aging question. Nobody in Springfield ages. Bart has been 10 years old since 1989. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge have not accumulated a single visible year across 3.5 decades of real time. The show uses a floating timeline, a storytelling device that allows the characters to exist in whatever year the current episode is set in, without the years accumulating on their bodies or in their personal histories. Various explanations for this have been proposed. The radiation theory suggests that the contamination has altered the biology of Springfield's residents in ways that affect the normal aging process. The conventional explanation is simply that it is how animated shows work, a production convention that allows the show to continue indefinitely. The coma theory's explanation is the simplest and the saddest. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who lost consciousness in April 1993 and has not regained it. Homer's dreaming brain cannot imagine his children growing up because it was not present to witness their growth. It has no memory of Bart at 11 or 12 or 15. It has no record of Lisa at 9 or 10 or 23. It has Bart at 10 and Lisa at 8 and Maggie at 1. Frozen at the ages they were on the day the vending machine fell, because those are the ages Homer's memory holds and those are the only ages his dreaming mind has access to. Of course, his wife does not age in the dream. The last time he saw her before he lost consciousness, she looked exactly as she does in every episode since. His neighbors and friends do not change because his memory of them is frozen at the moment the machine fell. The dream preserves the world exactly as it existed on the last day Homer was part of it, because that is what the dreaming mind does with the things it loves most. It holds them. It keeps them from changing. It refuses to let the version of reality it cannot update become something unrecognizable. The celebrity appearances that flood the later seasons of the show take on a specific meaning within this framework. Homer is lying in a hospital room. There is a television on somewhere nearby. Visitors speak in the hallway. Nurses have conversations within earshot. The radio plays. Sounds and names and fragments of cultural information drift through the fog of his unconsciousness, and his dreaming brain processes what it receives, incorporates the fragments, and translates them into characters within the world it is constructing. Every celebrity who appears in Springfield in the later seasons is, under this reading, a voice that Homer heard through the static of unconsciousness, a name that registered somewhere in his damaged auditory processing and became a face in the town his mind is maintaining. The celebrity flood in the later seasons is not a symptom of the show's writers becoming starstruck or losing confidence in their own cast of characters. It is a symptom of a brain that is losing its capacity for original narrative generation and becoming increasingly dependent on external fragments to populate the world it is dreaming. The later seasons become more surreal and untethered from reality, not because the writers are less disciplined. They become more surreal because the dreaming brain generating them is losing the organizational capacity that the early dream drew on for structure. The show has addressed the coma theory directly, and the way it chose to do so is itself worth examining. In its 34th season, the show produced and released what was described as a leaked, deleted scene from an episode. In the scene, Homer wakes up from a coma, looks around in bewilderment, and realizes that every impossible thing that had ever happened to him, every outlandish adventure, and every physics-defying survival was a dream generated by his unconscious mind during a long hospital stay. The revelation is played out fully. The scene was animated and voiced to completion. The show then revealed that the scene was not real. It was a hoax, a fake deleted scene planted by fictional hackers within the show's universe. The writers stepped in to clarify that Homer had never actually been in a coma, and the theory was not true. But they made the scene. They animated the theory's conclusion. They showed it to the audience in a complete, finished, professional piece of content. And then they wrapped it in a denial and called the denial the official position. Al Jean, the show's executive producer, addressed the theory in a 2015 interview. He said it was not true. He said it was fan speculation with no basis in the creator's intentions. What he did not address? Why nobody ages? What he did not explain? The tonal shift that maps onto neurological deterioration? What he left untouched? God's comment 6 months before the coma. What he did not account for, the pattern of escalating surreality across the seasons that corresponds to what a dreaming brain does as it loses function. He said it was not true. The interviewer moved on. The fans did not. Because the theory does something no official explanation has managed, it makes the entire run of the show cohere. The aging freeze, the tonal shift, the impossible events, the celebrity flood, the reset button that erases consequences between episodes, Homer's superhuman resilience, all of it resolves under a single premise. Homer is unconscious. The show is his dream, and the dream follows the rules of the dreaming mind, not the rules of the waking world. If this theory is true, and we are spending time in it tonight not because we are certain it is true, but because it is worth living inside for a while, then the emotional core of The Simpsons is not what it appears to be on the surface. On the surface, the show is a comedy about a lovable, incompetent, and his long-suffering family in a town full of colorful characters. Underneath the coma theory, the show is something else entirely. It is the sustained dream of a man who loves his family more than anything else in the world and cannot bear to be separated from them, even in unconsciousness. Even in a hospital room where his body is failing and the world is moving on without him, he wants Marge to still be his wife and to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous, difficult, alive boy. He wants Lisa to still be there with her saxophone and her earnestness and her moral rigor that frustrates him even as it makes him proud. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold. He wants the house on Evergreen Terrace to still exist and to still be his house, full of his family, the way it was on the last normal morning before the hospital and the vending machine and the 7 weeks of unconsciousness. And in the dream it is. All of it is. The dream gives him everything he wants. His family, preserved exactly as they were. His children, never growing older without him. His wife, never leaving, never aging into someone whose life has moved forward while his stayed still. The dream does not end. The credits roll and everything resets, and the next episode begins with the family on the couch and Homer stumbling through the door, and the house unchanged, and the town unchanged, and the loop intact. And every time that happens, every time the reset occurs, and Springfield returns to its starting position, and Homer is back at the plant, and Bart is back at school, and the world continues as it has always continued, that is not lazy writing. That is Homer's mind refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, if the dream runs out, if the last episode finally plays and the credits roll for the last time and the loop cannot restart, Homer faces something far worse than anything Springfield has ever invented to threaten him. He faces the question of whether Marge is still sitting beside his bed, whether his children are still there, whether they look the way he remembers them, or whether 30 years have reshaped them into people his frozen image of them would not recognize, or whether nobody is sitting there anymore, whether the room is empty, Whether too much time has passed for the kind of vigil that people keep in the early days to still be something anyone is maintaining, that is the coma theory. Homer Simpson has been dreaming since the 1st of April 1993. Every episode since then is a love letter, signed in the language of a dreaming brain, addressed to the family of a man who cannot reach them any other way. The show will never confirm this, but it will also never fully disprove it, because the evidence is inside the structure of the show itself, waiting for anyone patient enough to read it. Let your mind stay with Homer in the hospital for a moment. The fluorescent light. The beep of the monitor. The dream of a house on Evergreen Terrace where everyone is home and dinner is on the table and nobody has to say goodbye. We will continue. Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? The summer of 1995. If you were watching American television that summer and were of an age to care about it, you know what the summer felt like. The O.J. Simpson trial was running. The internet was beginning to become something that ordinary people had access to and used. And The Simpsons was doing something that no animated show had ever attempted in the history of the medium. A mystery. A genuine, constructed, clue-embedded, nationally promoted mystery. The kind that usually only existed in prestige dramas and detective novels. A whodunit, with real suspects and real evidence and real misdirection, promoted with the kind of media infrastructure that turned a cartoon mystery into a genuine cultural event. Fox ran promotional materials. America's Most Wanted, a real television show about real crimes, produced a tie-in special called Springfield's Most Wanted that treated the fictional shooting of a fictional billionaire with the same earnest seriousness it brought to its regular content. Newspapers covered the mystery. Early internet forums, running on college servers and dial-up connections, hosted debates that could run for days. The Simpsons that summer was not a cartoon that happened to be popular. It was a national puzzle that people were genuinely trying to solve. At the center of the puzzle was this. At the end of the 6th season, Mr. Burns had finally gone too far. The full accounting of what Burns had done in the weeks leading up to his shooting is worth laying out in detail, because the totality of it is what made the mystery so credible. This was not a single act of villainy. It was a sustained campaign against the welfare of everyone in Springfield, executed without apparent remorse and with the confidence of a man who had never been meaningfully held accountable for anything. He had discovered oil beneath Springfield Elementary School and drilled for it, stealing the revenue that should have funded the school's operations, and eliminating the budget that Bart and Lisa and every other child in Springfield depended on for their education. He had engineered the financial destruction of Moe's Tavern, which was not just a bar, but a community institution, a place where people in Springfield gathered and felt known and belonged. He had created a sinkhole through his construction activity that collapsed the Springfield retirement castle, displacing the elderly residents including Grandpa Simpson. He had caused an injury to Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, which in a small town reads as personal in a way that economic harm sometimes does not. And then, for his finale, he built a device. A massive mechanical disc that he positioned over Springfield and used to block the sun. Not symbolically, not as a negotiating position or a demonstration. Burns physically removed sunlight from Springfield so that every resident would be forced to run their lights and appliances from electricity generated by his plant. He wanted to be the only source of power the town had access to, including the sun itself. He wanted control so complete that even daylight was something he provided and could withhold. When Smithers, his devoted assistant and the person most committed to his well-being, objected to the plan and was fired for objecting, every remaining argument that Burns was serving any interest beyond his own greed collapsed. By the end of the first part of the two-part episode, the show had spent considerable time establishing clear and specific motives for dozens of named characters. Homer, because years of working for a man who could never remember his name, who looked through Homer every time they were in the same room, had finally accumulated into something he could not contain. Bart and Lisa, because the school was gutted. Grandpa, because his home was destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, because Burns's actions had cost him his livelihood. Tito Puente, the musician, because the school's music program was eliminated. Moe, because his bar went under and a piece of his identity went with it. Even Smithers, freshly fired and unmoored for the first time in his adult life. The entire town gathered at a meeting to confront Burns. Multiple people were visibly armed. The atmosphere was electric with the specific tension of a community that has reached the end of its collective patience. Then the gun went off. Burns staggered out of the meeting and fell onto the town's sundial. His hands landed on two specific letters as he collapsed, W and S. Or, looked at from the perspective of Burns lying on his back looking up, M and S. The ambulance came, the screen went dark. America had an entire summer to think about it. When the resolution aired in September 1995, it played as a comedic procedural. Chief Wiggum led the investigation with the bumbling confidence of a man who is certain he is more competent than the evidence suggests. Smithers, the initial suspect, confessed immediately and was eliminated when it became clear that he had been blackout drunk during the shooting and had actually shot a completely different person in a completely different location. He shot Jasper in the man's wooden leg, across town, at the wrong time, under the wrong circumstances. He was not the shooter. One by one, the suspects were cleared through alibis. Skinner had been elsewhere. Moe had been elsewhere. Tito Puente delivered what the show presented as the most memorable alibi in television history, performing a full musical number that demonstrated he had processed his rage creatively instead of violently, which is both an alibi and a life philosophy, and the episode acknowledged both dimensions of this. The investigation found a physical clue, an eyelash on Burns's suit. DNA analysis placed its origin in the Simpson family. Homer's fingerprints were on the gun. He had the most clearly documented motive of anyone at the meeting. He was arrested. He was about to be convicted. Burns woke from his coma. He identified his shooter, Maggie Simpson, a baby. According to Burns's account, delivered from a hospital bed upon regaining consciousness, he had encountered Maggie in the parking lot after the town meeting ended. He had tried to take her lollipop. In the struggle, his gun fell from his holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. The case was closed. No jury would convict a baby. Life went on. Except, the contest that Fox ran around the mystery, the one with the prize of being animated into a future episode, received thousands of entries. According to the DVD commentary for the episodes, not a single person in the randomly selected sample of those entries had identified the correct answer. Nobody won the prize. A participant was selected at random from the submission pool, and because that person had given the wrong answer, they received a cash settlement instead of the promised prize. The show's own creators acknowledged on that same commentary that they were aware of exactly one person who had posted the correct answer online on the night the first part aired. That person was using a college internet account that was no longer active by the time the contest concluded. The producers could not find them. They put out an open invitation on the DVD release for that person to come forward and claim the prize. They never did. Think carefully about what this means. The show's creators promoted this mystery as solvable from the clues embedded in the first part. They said the evidence was there and viewers could figure it out. They ran a national contest around this premise. And when the answer was revealed, essentially no one had solved it from the available evidence. Either the clues were not as clear as advertised, the misdirection was more effective than a fair mystery permits, or the answer did not follow from the evidence in the way that a well-constructed mystery requires. Any of these possibilities is interesting. All of them together suggest that the official answer, Maggie did it, is less solid than the show's confidence in presenting it would imply. Start with Burns's own statement about the sundial. Burns fell and his hands landed on letters. The show uses this as its central clue, the visual evidence that the victim himself accidentally pointed toward his shooter, M and S, Maggie Simpson. But Burns stated explicitly within the episode that his hands falling on those specific letters was not intentional. He did not think about where his hands were landing. He simply fell, and his hands landed where they landed. The sundial is a coincidence, by the victim's own testimony. The central clue in a nationally promoted mystery is something the person it supposedly came from described as meaningless. The gun offers a separate problem. Burns carried a weapon in a holster. Shortly before the shooting, the show depicts his holster as empty. The gun was already missing from his person before the attack. This means the shooter did not bring a weapon to the town meeting. The shooter encountered Burns's gun somewhere and used it. This matters for the suspect profile. Most of the people at the meeting who had established motives were shown arriving armed. They had brought weapons because they were angry enough at Burns to contemplate using them. The shooter was someone who had not brought a weapon, had not planned this in advance, had stumbled into possession of Burns's gun and made an impulsive decision. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this description, but so does a significant number of other characters, including some who were never seriously investigated. Then there is what Burns said as the shooter approached. He said, in a tone of recognition rather than alarm, something to the effect that he recognized his attacker. He was not startled. He was not afraid. He acknowledged the person with the calm familiarity of someone greeting a known quantity that they do not consider a threat. Has Burns ever had a meaningful interaction with Maggie Simpson before this episode? The show has not established a relationship between them. Burns barely remembers Homer's name, and Homer has worked directly under him for years. The idea that Burns would see an infant in a parking lot and respond with the calm recognition of someone greeting a familiar acquaintance does not fit the character as the show has constructed him. In the 18th season of the show, Homer claims, on camera, that he was actually the one who shot Burns. He says this and nobody responds to it. Nobody calls Wiggum. Nobody reopens the case. The confession of a man claiming responsibility for the attempted murder of the wealthiest person in Springfield is treated as a throwaway remark, a line that passes without consequence. Either Homer is lying for the attention that lying sometimes produces in his personality, which is entirely possible, or he is telling the truth and nobody in Springfield has the institutional capacity or the will to pursue it. The Marge theory has the most detailed case among the alternate possibilities. The argument runs like this. Marge had watched Burns systematically dismantle the things that protected her family and her community. The school where her children were educated was gutted. Her family's dog was injured. The son was stolen from the town where her children played outside every day. Her motivation was not wounded pride or professional resentment. It was maternal protection, which is a different register entirely. The episode in which Burns developed an infatuation with Marge is then factored in. If Burns had feelings for Marge that he never fully released, feelings that complicated his emotional response to her in ways his relationship with other Springfield residents did not, then his behavior in the wake of the shooting reads differently. Burns woke from a coma with a bullet wound. He knew who had shot him, and he chose not to identify her. He looked around the room for the most legally consequence-free answer available, found it in an infant who could not be prosecuted and could not articulate a denial, and gave investigators what they needed to close the case. Maggie, in this reading, was the perfect fall figure. She absorbed the accusation without consequences. She could not deny it in terms that would be taken seriously. Chief Wiggum himself noted that no jury would convict a baby, which means the case closes without anyone being punished, which is exactly the outcome someone who wanted to protect the real shooter would design. The alternate endings that were produced before the writers settled on Maggie are the final piece worth examining. A complete alternate conclusion was animated in which Smithers is revealed as the real shooter. Fully produced, fully voiced, available to watch. It was shown in a clip show format hosted by the character Troy McClure, who dismissed it by noting that accepting it would require ignoring the Simpson DNA evidence, which would be, he said, downright nutty. The reference embedded in that line is to the O.J. Simpson trial, which had concluded shortly before the episode aired, and in which a jury had acquitted a defendant in a case where DNA evidence pointed toward guilt. The show was winking. It was telling its audience, directly and with a specific real-world example, that the official answer is not always the right answer, and that evidence can be arranged to point wherever the people who control it want it to point. The official answer is Maggie. The show committed to this. The writers stand behind it. But the contest nobody won, the clues that the victim himself described as coincidental, the alternate endings that were fully animated and produced, Homer's Season 18 confession that nobody investigated, and the final shot of Maggie alone in an empty room, checking her surroundings before mimicking gunfire. Taken together, they suggest that the greatest mystery in the show's history was not solved. It was closed. And in Springfield, as we have already begun to learn, those are not the same thing. Let the mystery breathe. It has been 30 years without resolution, and 30 more will not change that. Section 4. Mr. Burns and the immortality question. The question of Mr. Burns's age is one the show has never directly answered, and the evasiveness is itself part of the picture. Various episodes have established various things about when Burns was born and what he remembers from his own experience. He has referenced events from before the turn of the 20th century as personal memories. He has spoken about figures who died in the early decades of the last century with the familiarity of someone who knew them. He attended Yale. He served in some capacity during World War II, in a role the show characterizes as at least morally ambiguous. He stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during that war and kept it concealed for decades. He has described the Gilded Age not as a chapter in a history book, but as a period he moved through. By the most careful reading of the show's internal timeline, Burns was born sometime in the late 19th century. By the most conservative estimate consistent with the details the show has provided across its run, he is well over 100 years old. By readings that take certain specific references at face value, rather than treating them as jokes about his age, he might be approaching 140. And he is not simply surviving at this age. He is functioning at the apex of his cognitive capability. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manipulates municipal and state politics with a precision that nobody in Springfield can match. He understands modern finance, modern law, and modern technology well enough to maintain and expand his holdings across decades. He plans with a clarity and a horizon that no one around him can sustain. A man who is, by any honest accounting of the evidence, somewhere between 100 and 140 years old, operating at a higher strategic level than anyone around him, in a world that should have long since taken him beyond the capacity for sustained complex cognition. That requires an explanation. The explanation the show provides is embedded in an episode that most people remember primarily as a fun X-Files parody, and which is actually one of the most significant pieces of canon in the entire series. Burns undergoes weekly medical treatments. The show does not specify the full composition of these treatments, but it describes their effects. After each session, Burns's body emits visible light. His tissues have been saturated with radiation and chemical compounds to such a degree that he produces a green glow. This is not metaphorical. Burns glows in the dark. And the treatment is not optional, not supplemental, not a health routine that improves his quality of life. Without it, Burns dies. The treatment keeps him alive for 7 days. Then he needs another dose. Miss a dose, and Burns's biological functions cease. This means Burns is not surviving through any process that would be recognized as normal biology. He is being maintained artificially, with a schedule that permits zero error. His life is managed the way a complicated machine is managed, through regular service intervals performed by people who understand exactly what happens if the service is skipped. This also means that Burns's continued existence is dependent on the continued existence of the infrastructure that administers his treatment, which is dependent on the continued existence of the fortune that funds that infrastructure. Everything feeds back into everything else. Burns must maintain his wealth and his power and his position because his treatments depend on the systems his wealth and power maintain. He cannot simply retire. He cannot allow his empire to weaken. Every part of his operation is, at its foundation, life support. Smithers is the linchpin of this system. His role in Burns's life is understood by most viewers as loyal personal assistance and the expression of a complicated devotion that the show has explored across many episodes. But underneath the emotional complexity is a practical reality that the show has established explicitly. Smithers manages Burns's schedule. Smithers ensures Burns keeps every weekly appointment. Smithers monitors Burns's physical condition with the vigilance of someone who understands that his employer's survival is directly contingent on a sequence of actions being completed on time, every week, without exception. The show has established multiple times that if Smithers were ever absent, if he were removed from his position or simply unavailable for a period, Burns would be in immediate peril. Not emotionally at sea, not managerially challenged, in danger of dying because the person who coordinates his survival protocol would not be there to coordinate it. Smithers is keeping Burns alive through administrative competence, and both of them know it. Whatever else their relationship contains, it rests on this foundation. Then there is the disease situation. In a scene that has become one of the most frequently quoted and referenced in the show's history, Burns visits a doctor for an assessment. The doctor delivers his findings. Burns has every disease known to medical science. Every single one simultaneously present in his body at the same time. The doctor's explanation for why this has not killed Burns is described as Three Stooges syndrome. Every disease in Burns's body is competing to kill him. Because they are all present and all active at the same time, none of them can gain dominance. They block each other. The gridlock of competing fatal conditions prevents any individual condition from progressing to the point where it can actually succeed. Burns is the sickest man in America, the doctor concludes, but functionally indestructible because everything that should kill him is being held in check by everything else that should kill him. The show plays this for sustained laughter. It is a genuinely funny scene built on a concept that is absurd enough to be delightful while being specific enough to stick in the memory. But connected to the weekly radiation treatments and the comedy becomes something else. Burns's body is not maintaining this disease equilibrium through luck or genetics or any natural process. The treatments are doing it. They are not curing his diseases. They are managing them, holding each condition in a state of suspended competition with every other condition, preventing any single illness from achieving the dominance that would allow it to succeed. Burns's body is a reactor. The treatments are the control rods. They regulate the system and prevent catastrophic failure. Remove them, and the diseases surge forward simultaneously, and Burns dies not from one thing but from everything at once. This is nuclear maintenance applied to a human body, and the man performing this maintenance is the same man who has been negligently managing, or deliberately mismanaging, the nuclear maintenance of the Springfield power plant for decades. He understands exactly what controlled radiation does to biological systems. He is living proof of it. The Burns family dynasty adds a layer to the immortality question that the show raises but does not answer. Burns's wealth is old in a way that is different from simply being large. The show has depicted the Burns family lineage as one of the oldest and most continuously powerful in American history. Not merely wealthy, but the kind of wealthy that precedes the systems that regulate wealth, that built infrastructure in an era before infrastructure was routinely regulated, that has been in continuous control of its holdings for so long that the concept of accountability became, somewhere along the way, a thing that applied to other people. Burns inherited this. He has been extending it for over a century. The dynasty predates him. It will survive him if it survives him. And the question the show gestures toward, without pursuing directly, is what the pattern has been. Burns uses radiation treatments and private medical technology to sustain himself beyond what biology would allow. Before those technologies existed, before nuclear medicine was a field, before the specific interventions that currently keep Burns alive were available, what did the family do? The show does not say, but it establishes, through the sheer age of the fortune and the continuity of control, that something has always allowed the Burns family to hold on to power longer than ordinary succession would explain. Whether this has always involved some form of artificial life extension, or whether Burns represents the first member of the dynasty to live long enough to need it, is a question that sits open in the show's margins, never addressed, never closed. Burns has come closer to dying than almost any other character in the show. He has been shot, hospitalized repeatedly, collapsed, attacked, abandoned in wilderness without survival resources, and every time he comes back. Not through the passive resilience that allows Homer to survive his impossible injuries, Burns comes back through active intervention. Through the machinery of wealth that ensures there is always someone standing by with the resources to stabilize him and return him to the schedule that keeps him alive. Homer survives because the show needs him to. Burns survives because he has spent a century constructing a system designed to ensure his survival regardless of what happens to his body. Homer's immortality is a narrative convention. Burns's immortality is an engineering project. 100 years of accumulated resource and institutional design, all of it ultimately in service of keeping one man's weekly appointments. Every dollar Burns has spent, every institution he has influenced, every political connection he has cultivated, every physician he has retained, every pharmaceutical research program he has funded, at its foundation, it all serves one purpose: keep Burns alive. Keep the treatments coming, keep the diseases balanced, keep the reactor running. And here is the dimension of the theory that is most unsettling when you stay with it. Springfield needs Burns to live too. The town's economy flows through the plant. The plant requires Burns's ownership and management to function the way it has always functioned. Burns requires the weekly treatments. The treatments require the infrastructure that Burns's wealth provides. It is a closed system, a self-sustaining loop in which the man and the machine and the money all depend on each other in a cycle that has no natural exit point. Springfield cannot afford to kill Burns even when it has reason to want him gone, because Springfield cannot survive the consequences of what killing Burns would set in motion. And Burns cannot die because dying would mean, finally and irreversibly, that the empire he has built would have to answer for what it has done. The radiation would have to be acknowledged. The violations would have to be remediated. The people who have been living in the contamination zone would have to be told what had been done to them. Burns is not immortal, he is too expensive to die. And Springfield keeps paying the bill because the alternative? A Springfield without Burns and without the plant, and without the economic infrastructure they generate, is something no one in the town has been allowed to imagine. He will keep his weekly appointment. He always does. The glow will return, the 7 days will reset, and Springfield will continue exactly as it is, exactly as it has always been, for as long as the treatments hold. Section 5. The Maggie Simpson Theory. In the corner of every room, there is Maggie. She does not speak, she does not walk reliably. She communicates through the sound of a pacifier and through a particular quality of gaze that the show's animators have developed over 36 years into its own subtle and expressive language. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old since 1989. And in that time, without forming a sentence, she has done more than any other member of her family. She shot a billionaire and walked away because the legal system had no framework for punishing someone who had not yet learned to read. She organized a rebellion at a daycare facility, coordinating infants against an authoritarian administrator in a campaign that succeeded completely. She saved her family from life-threatening situations on multiple occasions through interventions that her family never fully credited to her. She demonstrated problem-solving capabilities, in real time and under pressure, that adults in the same situation could not have matched. She was tested and found to possess an intelligence that available measurement tools could not adequately describe. The show played this for a quick laugh and moved to the next scene. The pattern did not change, and through all of it she has maintained her silence. Not as a developmental limitation, not as a character trait that exists for comedic contrast with her loud and relentless family. The theory that has accumulated around Maggie across years of close watching proposes something more specific and more interesting. Her silence is a decision, made by a mind intelligent enough to recognize that silence is the most effective tool available to a person who has correctly analyzed the environment she is operating in. Let us look at The Longest Daycare, which is the most sustained and systematic demonstration of Maggie's capabilities that the show has produced. It is a theatrical short film from 2012, nominated for an Academy Award, running 7 minutes. And in those 7 minutes, Maggie does things that are not consistent with any normal developmental profile for a 1-year-old. The situation is this. Maggie is dropped off at a daycare facility that is run with rigid authoritarian efficiency by a character who sorts the children into groups based on intelligence assessments, placing Maggie with the children identified as least capable. Inside the facility, Maggie encounters a caterpillar in the process of becoming a butterfly. She wants to protect it. A bully named Gerald wants to destroy it. What follows is a 7-minute sequence in which Maggie outmaneuvers the bully, circumvents the facility's security systems, manages the staff's attention through deliberate misdirection, and orchestrates the butterfly's safe escape. She does all of this without speaking a word. She does it through observation, through analysis of the environment around her, through the development of a strategy, through real-time adaptation when the initial strategy encounters obstacles, and through execution that requires precise timing, accurate modeling of other people's behavior, and the ability to maintain a complex plan across multiple simultaneous variables. Her body falls down when she moves too fast. She has to crawl when the situation calls for running. Her motor skills are genuinely those of a 1-year-old, limited and unreliable, and physically insufficient for what the situation demands. But her decision-making is perfect throughout. Every choice she makes is the correct choice. Every move she makes is optimized. Her intelligence compensates for every physical limitation her body imposes, and she succeeds completely in a situation that would challenge most adults. This is a repeating pattern across every appearance Maggie makes in the show, where she is given something to do beyond sitting in her high chair. The intelligence demonstrated in The Longest Daycare is not exceptional for Maggie, it is representative. The other episodes where her capabilities are directly demonstrated show the same thing. A mind operating at a level that her physical form cannot keep pace with, housed in a body that the world around her consistently and significantly underestimates. Now look at what the show has established about intelligent women in this family. Lisa Simpson is a genuine academic prodigy. Her IQ is documented, her capabilities are repeatedly demonstrated, her intelligence is described by every adult in her life who is honest about it as exceptional. She is the smartest person in most rooms she enters. She knows it, the show knows it, the audience knows it, and what has it gotten her? Isolation. Consistent dismissal. A pattern of speaking up and being ignored. A pattern of being right about things and watching the people around her fail to act on what she has correctly identified, because acting would require acknowledging that an 8-year-old girl understands the situation better than the adults managing it. Lisa is brilliant, and she is lonely, and she is, across the entire run of the show, largely unable to translate her intelligence into outcomes that change the things she cares about changing. Not because her intelligence is insufficient, because the environment she is in does not reward it. Maggie has watched this from the beginning. She was born into a household where the most visible model of what happens to an intelligent girl in Springfield plays out every day in front of her. She has observed her sister fight constantly, argue constantly, attempt to improve things constantly, and receive nothing but resistance for the effort. She has processed what she has seen with the analytical capacity she possesses, which is considerable, and she has reached a conclusion that is different from the one Lisa reached. Lisa's conclusion is that you keep fighting because fighting is the only option that is consistent with who you are, even if the cost is high and the outcomes are disappointing. Maggie's conclusion is that visible intelligence in Springfield is a liability. That announcing yourself as the smartest person in the room is an invitation for the room to make sure you understand how little that matters. That the moment you reveal what you are capable of, you become something people want to manage. That the effective strategy is not to fight to be seen, but to remain unseen, and to operate from within the space that invisibility provides. Consider what Maggie's invisibility has allowed her to accomplish. She shot a man, and the investigation never seriously considered her as a suspect for more than a moment, because who seriously investigates a baby? She organized infants against an institution, and the institution never saw it coming, because who monitors babies closely enough to see them planning? Every heroic or remarkable thing Maggie has done, it has happened in the margins of the show's attention and the characters' attention alike. It has happened in spaces that adults leave unmonitored because they are certain that nothing significant could be happening there. She has maintained this invisibility through the most effective possible disguise. She appears to be exactly what everyone already expects a baby to be: passive, dependent, present, but not consequential. The pacifier in her mouth is not a comfort object. It is a cover, a way of consistently presenting the image of infant dependency, while the mind behind the image does whatever the mind has decided needs doing. The final shot of the Burns shooting episode is worth returning to in this context, not to resolve the question of whether she pulled the trigger, but to examine what the scene reveals about her cognitive and strategic capacity, regardless of what she did. Everyone has left the room. Maggie is alone. She looks around carefully. She does not make her move until she has confirmed that there are no observers. Then she performs the gesture, moving her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. Think about the sequence of actions required to produce that scene. Awareness that there are other people in the room. Awareness that certain things should not be done in front of other people. The judgment to wait until the room is clear before doing the thing that should not be done in front of others. And then, when the observation is complete and the conditions are confirmed, the performance of the action. That is not infant behavior. Infants do not check to see if they are being watched before doing things. The developmental capacity required for privacy and the deliberate suppression of behavior in social contexts appears considerably later in normal human development. What Maggie demonstrates in that final shot is the situational awareness of someone who understands exactly what happened, understands that the action she is recreating is significant, and has decided that recreating it is something to do only in private. Whether she is remembering or confessing, the sequence is evidence of a mind that operates with more sophistication than a 1-year-old should have. Now connect this to the radiation theory and the specific way the theory predicts that environmental contamination affects individuals differently. Homer and Maggie are from the same family. They have absorbed the same environmental contamination, filtered through the specific circumstances of their individual biologies. In Homer, the contamination reduced his cognitive capacity to a level the show has described as a clinical disability. In Maggie, if the radiation theory is correct, the contamination or some interaction between the contamination and her specific developmental circumstances has produced the opposite result. His father's cognitive capacity diminished. His youngest child's expanded beyond measurement. Same source, same family. Same water and air and decades of proximity to those cracked cooling towers. Two entirely different outcomes. Homer and Maggie are the far ends of the spectrum that the Springfield nuclear plant has created in the human population living in its shadow. He is what happens when the mutation takes something away. She is what happens when it amplifies something instead. And if the coma theory is true, the framework shifts in a direction that is softer and sadder and more human than the radiation explanation. Homer cannot see Maggie grow up. He is lying in a hospital bed while she moves through a life he cannot access. He cannot be present for the milestones he will miss. So, in the dream, he gives her something extraordinary. He makes her capable of things no baby should be capable of. Because he needs to believe, in whatever way an unconscious mind believes things, that she will be okay without him there to protect her. He cannot watch over her. He cannot guide her. He cannot be the father he wants to be for the smallest and most vulnerable of his children. So he dreams her as extraordinary. He dreams her as capable beyond all normal measure. He dreams her as someone who will not need protection because she is already the most formidable person in the room. Maggie's genius in the coma theory is Homer's prayer for his youngest child, written in the language of a dreaming brain and offered to the universe of the dream because it is the only place where he can still give her anything. But back in the waking world, or in whatever version of the waking world Springfield represents, there is a harder reading available. Maggie does not speak because speaking gets you nothing in Springfield. She does not reveal what she is capable of because capability is punished in Springfield, not rewarded. She watches everything and remembers everything and understands everything, and she waits. For what? The show has never said. Maggie's endgame is the last genuinely unsolved mystery in the Simpson family. She is the only character whose potential has not been fully revealed because she has spent 36 years making sure nobody knows what her potential actually is. We have seen glimpses. We have seen her shoot a man. We have seen her command infants. We have seen her solve problems that stump adults. We have seen the family trust her judgment on matters she should not be able to judge, and we have seen them not question how she knows what she seems to know. She is 1 year old. She cannot reliably cross a room without falling. She cannot form a sentence. And behind that pacifier, behind those enormous dark eyes, behind 36 years of perfect strategic silence, something is planning. Something is waiting for the moment when it has decided the conditions are right. When Maggie finally decides to act, nobody in Springfield will see it coming. That is exactly how she designed it. Endophile Section 6. The Principal and the Imposter. There is an episode of The Simpsons that fans have been arguing about since it aired. A single hour of television that generated more sustained resentment in the show's fan community than almost any other creative decision the series ever made. And the argument has never quite ended, because the episode did something that the fans found unforgivable and that, upon careful examination, turns out to be one of the most honest things the show ever produced. The episode is called The Principal and the Pauper. It was the second episode of the 9th season, which placed it in September of 1997. By that point, the show had been running for 8 years, and Principal Seymour Skinner was one of the most developed and familiar supporting characters in its cast. He had been built across 8 years of episodes into something specific. His complicated relationship with his mother, his dynamic with Bart, which mixed antagonism with something that occasionally looked like respect, his military background, and the way it shaped his administrative personality, his failed romance with the lunch lady, his frustrations with the school board, with the town, with a career that had not gone quite where he had hoped. All of it, in one episode, was revealed to have been constructed on a fiction. Here is what the episode disclosed. Springfield Elementary held a ceremony to celebrate Principal Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. In the middle of the event, a stranger arrived. Nobody recognized him. He introduced himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, a Vietnam War veteran who had been a prisoner of war and was believed dead. He had survived. He had escaped. He had made his way back to America, and he had come to Springfield expecting to reclaim his life, and found that someone else had been living it for 20 years. The man Springfield knew as Seymour Skinner was revealed to be Armin Tamzarian. Before his military service, Tamzarian had been a petty criminal, someone from a difficult background without prospects or direction, drafted into a war and placed in a unit alongside the real Seymour Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian felt responsible. He traveled to Springfield with the intention of telling Skinner's mother what had happened to her son. When he arrived, Agnes Skinner, consumed by grief and perhaps by need, assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son. And Tamzarian, who had never been wanted by anyone, who had never had a family or a home or an identity worth inhabiting, made a decision in that moment. He went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name and the rank and the identity and the relationship with Agnes, and he built a life inside the borrowed framework for 2 decades. He became a principal who genuinely educated children. He developed a relationship with Agnes that was real in every practical sense, even if its foundation was a misrepresentation. He spent 20 years becoming the person Springfield knew as Skinner so completely that, by the time the real Skinner walked through the door, there was almost no Armin Tamzarian remaining underneath. And then the real Skinner arrived. And everything the show had spent 8 years building was suddenly sitting on ground that had been removed from underneath it. Here is the part that the fans found unforgivable. Springfield held a meeting. Both men were present. The truth was fully established and documented. Every person in Springfield understood what they were hearing. Their principal had been living a stolen identity for 20 years. The actual owner of that identity was standing in front of them. The facts were not in dispute. And Springfield voted. Not on whether to press charges. Not on whether to help the real Skinner reclaim the life that had been occupied without his consent. Not on how to handle the extraordinary situation of 2 people asserting the same identity in the same room. They voted on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The vote was unanimous. They chose to keep the lie. Judge Snyder issued a legal decree stating that Armin Tamzarian was officially and legally and henceforth the real and legitimate Seymour Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the man who had survived a prisoner of war camp and navigated his way home across decades of difficulty, was placed on a railroad car and physically removed from Springfield. And the judge attached a provision making it explicitly illegal to ever refer to the truth of the matter again under penalty of punishment. A community made a collective, official, legally documented decision to treat a lie as reality and to criminalize the telling of the truth. Harry Shearer, who voices both Skinner and Burns among other characters, publicly expressed his deep unhappiness with the episode. The critical response was scathing. Fans ranked it among the worst episodes in the show's history, some among the worst in television history. The most common complaint was that the episode destroyed a beloved character by retroactively invalidating everything the show had established about him. His military service, built into his personality and his backstory. His relationship with Agnes, understood as a difficult and genuine bond between mother and son. His dynamic with Bart, filtered through his role as an authority figure. All of it was now resting on a lie. The fans were not wrong. The episode did do those things. What the fans' response did not fully engage with is whether the episode was wrong to do them. Because the episode is not lying about Springfield. It is showing you something about Springfield that has always been true. The town has always operated exactly the way this episode depicts it operating. The collective choice to maintain comfortable falsehood over uncomfortable truth is not a new behavior that the episode introduced. It is the operating principle that has governed Springfield since the show began. Every time a catastrophic event occurs and is forgotten by the following episode, every time something world-altering happens and the world fails to stay altered, every time a disclosure that should change everything fails to change anything, the mechanism at work is the same mechanism the episode depicted. Springfield votes to forget. Springfield votes to maintain the agreed-upon version of events. Springfield treats truth as a problem to be managed rather than a reality to be reckoned with. The only thing the principal and the pauper did differently is that it showed you the mechanism. It put the vote in the frame. It did not let the forgetting happen off-screen between episodes. It made the choice visible, the decree audible, the exile literal. The real Seymour Skinner was tied to a railroad car and removed from Springfield. That is a striking and uncomfortable image, but it is a physically literalized version of what Springfield does to the truth every single week. It puts the inconvenient thing somewhere it cannot be seen, and it makes it illegal to bring it back. Consider the specific pattern of forgetting that recurs across the show's run, and ask yourself what would have to be true about a population for this pattern to be possible. The town was sealed under a government dome, and the sealing was forgotten. The town experienced nuclear near misses and moved on. A man revealed to the community that his entire identity was constructed on a fraud. The community voted to institutionalize the fraud, and then returned to treating the fraud as simply true because they had voted that it was. Every catastrophe, every revelation, every moment that should have permanently altered the landscape of Springfield's self-understanding has been absorbed and neutralized and forgotten. This is not possible in a healthy population. People remember significant events. Communities process trauma through the accumulation of shared memory. Towns that experience disasters do not simply forget them between Tuesday and Thursday. Something specific must be operating in Springfield to enable this particular kind of systematic forgetting. The radiation theory has an answer. Chronic neurological damage from decades of contaminated water and air has compromised the cognitive architecture responsible for long-term memory consolidation and critical thinking. The town cannot sustain the kind of extended analytical processing that would be required to connect what happened last week to what is happening now. The coma theory has an answer. The dreaming mind does not maintain continuity between dreams. Each episode is a dream cycle that ends cleanly and begins fresh, and the dreaming brain does not carry forward the consequences of previous cycles because dreams do not operate on continuity. And the principal and the pauper offers a third answer that sits alongside both of these. Springfield resets because the town chooses to reset, collectively and deliberately, through an unspoken social contract that has been maintained for decades and that the episode made explicit and formal for the first time. The contract says, "We will not acknowledge what happened. We will maintain the agreed-upon version of events. We will treat the convenient fiction as the factual record. And anyone who refuses to participate in this agreement, anyone who insists on the truth in ways that threaten the fiction's maintenance, will be removed from the conversation, tied to a train, exiled to wherever the truth goes, when it is no longer welcome." The real Seymour Skinner is the show's clearest image of what happens to people who insist on truth in Springfield. He arrived with incontrovertible proof. He did not ask for revenge or punishment. He simply showed up as himself, carrying the evidence of who he was, expecting a community to acknowledge basic facts. And the community's response was to treat his presence as the problem, his truth as the threat, and his continued existence in the community as something that had to be ended. He was the most honest person in Springfield. That is why he had to leave. Now carry the principal and the pauper alongside the coma theory and see what the combination produces. If everything since season 4 is Homer's dream, then Homer's unconscious mind invented a story about an entire town voting to sustain a lie. The question worth asking is why? What does this story tell us about what Homer needs to believe in order for the dream to function? He needs to believe that stolen identities can become legitimate through collective agreement. He needs to believe that a fiction, maintained long enough and believed completely enough, can replace the authentic original and nobody will be compelled to correct the substitution. He needs to believe that the lie can hold indefinitely if everyone in the room agrees to hold it. Because that is what the coma is. It is a fake life standing in for the real one, a dream masquerading as waking experience. A version of Homer Simpson that is alive and stumbling through adventures and loving his family, presented as reality, while the actual Homer Simpson lies still in a hospital room and the world moves forward without him. The dream holds as long as nobody in the dream insists on the truth. The loop continues as long as Springfield keeps voting to maintain the fiction. Armin Tamzarian stays Seymour Skinner as long as everyone agrees he does. And the real Seymour Skinner stays tied to the railroad car. The Principal and the Pauper is not the worst episode of The Simpsons. It is the most uncomfortable one because it is the most honest one. It is the episode that shows you the infrastructure of everything you have been watching since 1989. The machinery of Springfield's denial. The social contract that allows a town of mutated residents to pretend they are normal, a man in a coma to pretend he is awake, a community built on comfortable lies to punish anyone who speaks the truth. Armin Tamzarian is still pretending to be Seymour Skinner. He has always been pretending. The difference is now Springfield has made it legal. And the last honest man is somewhere on a railroad track, going wherever the train goes, away from the only life that was ever actually his. Let that settle in the way that uncomfortable true things settle. The cooling towers are still visible from the elementary school. Nothing in Springfield ever really changes. We will continue. Section 7. Mona Simpson and the Burns Conspiracy. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official version. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, had told Homer this when Homer was young. He showed Homer a grave. Homer mourned. He grew up with the specific and lasting wound that comes from losing a parent too early, before you are old enough to have the internal resources to process what has happened. And he carried that wound into everything he subsequently became. Homer's desperate need to be liked. His terror of being alone. His clinginess toward Marge, his compulsive need for her reassurance that she is still there and still loves him and has not left, his willingness to absorb mistreatment from Burns rather than risk the economic security that his employment provides, because economic security is the only thing standing between his family and the kind of precarity that, for Homer, is inseparable from abandonment. His emotional structure, the scaffolding around which his personality is organized, is built on the assumption that he is a person whose mother chose not to stay. That assumption was a lie, and in the 7th season, the show said so. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It is one of the most emotionally precise things the show has ever produced, which is a remarkable thing to say about a show built on broad comedy. It aired in November 1995. And what it did was not simply reveal new information about Homer's backstory. It dismantled the story he had been telling himself about his own life, showed him the real story underneath, and then confronted him with a specific kind of grief that comes not from losing someone, but from learning that the loss was different, more complicated, and more costly than you had always believed. Here is what happened in the episode. Homer faked his own death to avoid working on a Saturday, which is the kind of motivated incompetence the show has always excelled at. He pushed a dummy off a cliff near the plant. The town believed him dead. When Marge insisted he go to the Hall of Records to correct the official death record, Homer found something in the municipal files that the town had been quietly holding. His mother was alive. According to the records, she had never died. The grave Abe had shown him belonged to Walt Whitman. Abe had been using the headstone of one of America's most celebrated poets as a stand-in for his wife's burial marker for the entirety of Homer's childhood and adult life. Homer found Mona at a cemetery, visiting the grave she believed was her son's. She did not recognize him immediately. 27 years had passed. He had become someone she did not know, shaped by her absence in ways she could not have predicted. When he proved to her who he was, they had a reunion that holds a specific kind of emotional weight. A grown man who has been carrying a motherless childhood for 3 decades, and the woman who has been carrying the knowledge of what that cost him, finding each other beside a headstone that belongs to neither of them. And then Mona told him the truth. She left because she had to, not because she stopped loving him, not because she wanted a different life. She left because staying would have put Homer and Abe in direct danger. She left because the man who would one day sign Homer's employment paperwork had made it impossible for her to remain. The story goes back to 1969. Mona was a housewife in Springfield. She was married to Abe and had a young son and lived the quiet domestic life of that particular moment in that particular kind of American town. And then, the world outside Springfield, which was very loud in 1969, became something she could not continue to ignore. She was radicalized by what she saw and heard. She joined a group of activists, and those activists targeted a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. Let that land fully. Burns did not only own a nuclear power plant, he owned a facility designed to research and manufacture biological weapons. A germ warfare laboratory, operating in Springfield, in the same town where families were raising children and children were going to school and ordinary American life was proceeding in the ordinary American way, while the wealthiest man in town was developing weaponized pathogens in a building a few miles down the road. Mona and her group broke into the facility and deployed what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, a device designed to destroy the biological agents stored inside. They succeeded. The weapons were neutralized. What they had set out to do, they did. But something went wrong in the chaos of the escape. Someone was knocked down in the confusion of the raid. And Mona, whose impulse to help people in distress was apparently a deep and defining part of her character, stopped. She stopped to help the person who had fallen. The person who had fallen was Mr. Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed. And Burns, lying on the ground in the aftermath of the raid, looked up and saw her face. He recognized her. He reported her to the FBI. And from that moment, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact Abe. She could not hold Homer or explain to him what was happening or say anything that might be traced back to her location. She went to Homer's room one final time while he slept. She kissed him. She left. For 27 years. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she had died. And Homer spent the next 3 decades of his life organized around the assumption that he was someone who had been left. Not someone whose mother had been driven away by a powerful man's vindictiveness. Someone whose mother had chosen not to be there. The difference between those two things is enormous. And Homer never knew which version was true. Now the conspiracy. The show reveals, in a later season, that there was a deal. Burns had committed a crime. Abe had discovered the crime. In exchange for Abe's silence, Burns guaranteed that Homer would always have a job at the plant, regardless of performance, regardless of the number of errors, regardless of how many times the circumstances should have led to termination. The deal made Homer's employment permanent. 742 documented workplace errors. Sleeping at the workstation, causing nuclear incidents. Missing his instrument readings. Failing every measurable standard of professional competence for 3 decades. And never being permanently let go, because a deal made in secret between his father and his mother's persecutor protected him. Homer has always been protected. But the protection was never for his benefit. Burns needed an incompetent safety inspector. He needed someone in that role who would not meaningfully enforce safety standards, who would allow the violations to continue, who would ensure that the 342 documented problems never became a set of 342 problems addressed. A competent safety inspector would have shut the plant down. A competent safety inspector would have started a chain of investigation that led to questions about what the plant had been doing and what it had done already to the people around it. Homer is the mechanism by which the plant remains operational. His incompetence is the most important safety feature of the facility, in the most darkly inverted sense. He is there to ensure that nothing is made safe. And Burns built Homer for this role by driving Mona away when Homer was 6 years old. Because the Homer who was raised without his mother, the Homer who grew up believing he was someone whose parent had chosen not to stay, the Homer who developed the specific emotional architecture of abandonment and desperation for approval that shaped his entire personality, was exactly the kind of person Burns's facility needed in that role. Grateful for any attention, unwilling to rock the boat, incapable of challenging authority in any sustained way because the alternative to compliance, losing the job, losing the stability, being left again, was more frightening than any level of mistreatment. Burns did not accidentally benefit from Homer's emotional damage. He caused it. By pursuing Mona and driving her underground, Burns ensured that Homer would grow up without the parent who might have given him the foundation to be a different person. A more stable person, a person capable of walking away from a dangerous job and a humiliating employer because his sense of himself did not depend on keeping them. Homer works at the power plant because Burns broke him as a child, and the broken version of Homer is exactly what Burns needed in that chair. The show confirms this directly in the moment where the crayon is removed and Homer's intelligence returns. The smart Homer, clear-eyed and articulate and capable of seeing his situation with something approaching clarity, sees the plant for what it is and finds it intolerable. He can understand the architecture of his own suffering for the first time. He can see Burns's role in his life and in his mother's life, and in the structure of Springfield itself. He can perceive the whole thing, and what he perceives is unbearable. So he has the crayon put back. He returns to the fog because the fog was protecting him from something too heavy to carry. But the choice was predetermined. Homer was never meant to see clearly in Springfield. The system made sure of that when he was still small enough that the system could reach him through his mother. Mona Simpson died in a later season. The scene in which Homer sits with her at the end of her life is one of the quietest and most devastating moments in the show's run. No jokes, no cutaway, no reset that restores everything to normal by the next scene. Just Homer and his mother and the 27 years between them that Burns had taken, and the weight of everything that could not be recovered. She fought. She was right to fight. She paid the full cost of having been right. And the man who imposed that cost on her, who used his power and his FBI connections and his 30-year grudge to ensure she could never come home, that man is still in his office above the plant, still keeping his weekly appointment, still alive and functional and untouched by any of the consequences that accumulated downstream of his choices. Burns won. He always wins. In Springfield, the man with the money writes the rules. The rules say Homer Simpson works at the plant. The rules say the violations continue. The rules say the water stays contaminated and the cooling towers stay cracked and the yellow-skinned residents of the contamination zone keep going about their lives without ever understanding what has been done to them. Burns made sure of all of this when Homer was 6 years old and sleeping in his bed and his mother kissed him goodbye in the dark. Homer never knew. He will probably never know. And that is the most Burns-like thing about the whole arrangement. Section 8. The Simpsons Predictions. Let us get the big one on the table immediately. In the year 2000, The Simpsons aired an episode called Bart to the Future. The story involved a flash forward to a future Springfield. And in that future, Lisa Simpson had become the first female president of the United States. The episode was a story about inherited responsibility and the particular challenge of inheriting power from someone who left things in poor condition. And the person Lisa inherited the presidency from was identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired in 2000. Trump was elected president in 2016. The Simpsons made a joke about the logical extreme of celebrity politics, attached a specific name to it, and then the specific thing happened 16 years later with the specific name attached. The cultural response to this was substantial and durable. The phrase "The Simpsons predicted" it became a piece of internet shorthand that extended well beyond the show's actual viewership. People who had not thought about The Simpsons in decades were sharing screenshots of a cartoon from the year 2000 and asking, in a tone that mixed genuine curiosity with something between amusement and unease, how the writers had known. This was not an isolated incident. The list of what the show appears to have predicted, when assembled, is long enough to have generated its own category of internet content and its own dedicated communities of researchers. In 1995, an episode depicted a wrist-mounted personal communication device that functioned as a portable computer, describing something that looked remarkably like a smartwatch decades before the technology existed in commercial form. In 1994, Homer traveled to space with Buzz Aldrin on a NASA mission, years before commercial space tourism became a real industry, with real civilian passengers purchasing tickets. In 1998, an equation appearing in the background of an episode was identified by mathematicians as a functional approximation of the Higgs boson's mass, a quantity that was not experimentally confirmed until 2012. In 1999, Homer proposed a theory about the shape of the universe that suggested it might be toroidal, shaped like a donut. Years after the episode aired, cosmological researchers examining patterns in cosmic microwave background radiation found evidence consistent with a toroidal universe geometry. A 1993 episode called Margin Chains depicted a flu virus originating in Asia and spreading to the United States, causing public panic, mass purchasing, and a chaotic community response to the outbreak. The episode aired 27 years before 2020, and in that 1993 episode, the panicking townspeople of Springfield accidentally released a swarm of killer bees alongside the flu scare, which acquired a specific resonance when Asian giant hornets, which the media immediately branded murder hornets, began appearing in the Pacific Northwest during the actual pandemic of 2020. In 1996, a Simpsons episode included a joke about the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. 28 years separated the joke from the reality. In 1998, the show depicted a major media corporation acquiring 20th Century Fox, which was presented as satire about the accelerating consolidation of the entertainment industry. Disney completed its acquisition of 20th Century Fox in 2019, 21 years between the joke and the transaction it described. Multiple episodes across different seasons depicted video calling technology, autocorrect failures, tablet computers, voice-activated home devices, and surveillance systems years before any of these became part of everyday consumer life. The question that every addition to this list generates is the same: how? Al Jean, the executive producer who has overseen the show for most of its run, has given the question a direct and somewhat deflating answer. He has described it as what happens when you throw enough darts. The show has produced nearly 800 episodes across 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, observations, and satirical extrapolations about where American culture, technology, and politics are heading. When you generate that volume of content over that span of time, statistical probability alone guarantees that some of it will align with future events. Bill Oakley, who ran the show's writer's room during some of its best-regarded seasons, put the same point even more plainly. Most of what people call predictions, he has said, are coincidences that look significant because the episodes are old enough that the world has had time to lap them. History repeats its patterns. The show made observations that were accurate about the direction things were moving, and eventually things moved far enough in those directions to catch up with the observations. Organizations that have examined the prediction phenomenon systematically, applying actual fact-checking standards to the most widely shared examples, have consistently found that most of them are rooted in trends that were already documented and observable when the episodes were written. The writers did not predict Trump's presidency through any form of access to future information. They observed that Trump had been publicly discussing the idea of running for office since the late 1980s, that he was a significant figure in the cultural imagination about wealth and celebrity and American ambition, and they extrapolated from those observations to a joke about where the intersection of celebrity culture and political ambition might eventually lead. The Trump episode was accurate because the underlying cultural analysis was accurate. The show read the present carefully and pushed it forward a few steps. The Disney-Fox example works the same way. The writers did not know in 1998 that Disney would acquire Fox in 2019. They observed that the entertainment industry was consolidating at an accelerating rate, that the economics of the business were pushing toward larger and larger entities absorbing smaller ones, and they wrote a joke about the logical endpoint of a process that was already visibly in motion. The prediction felt accurate when it came true because the underlying trend analysis was accurate. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been among the most formally educated in American television. Multiple writers have held degrees from Harvard and comparable institutions. Many have backgrounds in mathematics, the sciences, economics, and political theory. These are people who have spent their professional lives studying how systems work, how trends accelerate, what happens when you follow a given trajectory to its logical conclusion. They are not making random guesses. They are making educated extrapolations from careful observation, and occasionally those extrapolations land close enough to actual future events to generate the sense of prophecy. Then there is confirmation bias, which is doing substantial work in the perception of the prediction phenomenon. The Simpsons has made thousands of observations about American culture, and many of them have not come true. The jetpacks did not arrive. The specific political outcomes imagined in some episodes went differently. The cultural shifts anticipated in certain jokes did not materialize. Nobody catalogs those. Nobody assembles them into shareable content. Nobody builds a theory about The Simpsons around all the things it said would happen, and that did not. Confirmation bias operates in one direction. It selects for the hits and filters out the misses. And what remains after the filtering is a highlight reel that looks like an extraordinary and potentially supernatural record of accuracy. But the highlight reel is not the record. The record includes the thousands of darts that missed, which you are never shown because they do not support the narrative. When you filter 800 episodes containing thousands of observations through confirmation bias and then amplify the resulting highlights through the most powerful distribution mechanism in human history, which is the internet, you produce something that looks like prophecy, but is actually the predictable output of a large creative body of work applied to a confirmation filter. This is the rational explanation, and it is the correct one in most cases. But some specific instances resist this explanation in ways that are worth sitting with. The Trump prediction did not merely suggest that a celebrity might someday seek political office. It named Trump specifically, placed him in the Oval Office, and depicted him departing the presidency in circumstances that left the country in poor condition. And the episode that revealed this was set in a future where Lisa, the show's most principled character, had been handed the specific burden of cleaning up after the specific person the show had named. An episode about Siegfried and Roy did not merely make general observations about the risks of working with dangerous animals. It depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers during a show. In 2003, Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's white tigers during a live performance at the Mirage in Las Vegas. The specific animal, the specific act, the specific outcome during a performance. These are not vague trend extrapolations. They are specific in ways that make even rigorous debunkers pause for a moment. And this is where the most interesting reading of the prediction phenomenon enters. A reading that is more interesting than either the supernatural explanation or the pure coincidence explanation. The Simpsons does not merely predict the future. In some cases, The Simpsons participates in shaping it. The show has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. It has been one of the most watched, most quoted, most referenced, and most deeply embedded pieces of American media in the history of the medium. Its observations have become part of the cultural vocabulary. Its framings have become part of how Americans think about the systems they live inside. After 36 years, the show does not simply reflect American culture. American culture has grown up with the show's framings already built into it. When The Simpsons made a joke about Trump becoming president in 2000, that joke did not simply disappear after the episode aired. It circulated. It was quoted. It became a reference point in cultural conversations about celebrity politics and the trajectory of American democracy. It made the idea of a Trump presidency familiar in a specific register, the register of inevitable absurdist satire, of punchlines that write themselves. When Trump ran and won, the response was not pure shock. Part of it was recognition. This felt familiar. The Simpsons had already done this. We had already been here. The show did not predict the Trump presidency. The show made the Trump presidency feel, to a culturally significant portion of the American population, like something that had already been rehearsed. It normalized the idea before the idea arrived, and when it arrived, the normalization made it feel like prophecy. This is the mechanism underlying the most consequential of the show's accurate predictions. Not supernatural access to future information, cultural influence operating across time. The show shapes the imagination of its audience, and the audience's imagination shapes the world. And when the world eventually produces something that looks like what the show imagined, the loop closes, and the result is what feels like prophecy but is actually influence completing its cycle. Springfield did not see the future. Springfield shaped the future it appeared to see. And by the time the future arrived, so many people had spent so long living with Springfield's version of it that the reality felt less like a prediction coming true and more like a memory being confirmed. The predictions are not supernatural. They are the natural output of 3.5 decades of careful, educated observation of American life, filtered through a gifted team of writers, amplified by confirmation bias, and completed by the cultural influence that the longest-running scripted primetime show in the history of American television inevitably accumulates over its run. But try explaining that to someone who just watched a clip from 1997 that appears to describe a headline from this morning. Even knowing the mechanism, even understanding the statistics and the bias, something about the specific cases makes you want to sit with the possibility a little longer. 800 episodes, 36 years, and enough bullseyes in the wall to keep making people wonder. Section 9. Where is Springfield? Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history, and nobody knows where it is. This is not because the show forgot to decide. It is not because the writers were careless with their geography or indifferent to continuity. Springfield's location is unknown because the show decided that it should be unknown, and then spent 36 years actively maintaining that decision through deliberate and sustained geographic contradiction. The town has oceanfront property. It also has mountains accessible within driving distance, and deserts, and farmland in multiple directions, and forests dense enough to get lost in, and a river that connects to some larger body of water that the show has placed in different relative positions depending on the episode. It has experienced blizzards that buried it under several feet of snow. It has experienced tropical heat waves. It has been hit by hurricanes and earthquakes and tornadoes. It borders Ohio in some episodes and Nevada in others. It is near the Canadian border in one season and in relative proximity to Mexico in another. No single location in the continental United States has this combination of geographic features. The American map does not contain a point from which you could be simultaneously near an ocean, near mountains, near a desert, near the Canadian border, and near Mexico. Springfield's geography is a physical impossibility. The town exists in a space that cannot exist. This was a creative choice. Matt Groening has said so explicitly. He chose the name Springfield because it is one of the most common city names in America, and because when he was creating the show he had in mind a specific Springfield he was familiar with, Springfield, Oregon. But he and the writing staff built Springfield to be universal, rather than specific. The town is designed to feel like the hometown of every viewer, regardless of where they actually grew up. It is meant to resonate as familiar across the full geographic range of the American experience, which means it cannot be anchored to any particular region, because every anchoring choice would make it less universal. In 2012, Groening gave an interview to Smithsonian Magazine, in which he confirmed that the original inspiration for Springfield was Oregon. For a moment, the mystery appeared to be resolved. Springfield was in Oregon. The decades of geographic mystery had been collapsed into a direct statement from the creator. Then the show continued, and the show continued contradicting Oregon. Episodes released after the interview placed Springfield in geographic and cultural contexts incompatible with the Pacific Northwest. The writers did not treat Groening's admission as a directive. They continued building the geographic impossibility exactly as they had always built it. The mystery was momentarily interrupted, then it resumed. This is interesting because it suggests that the ambiguity is not just a production convenience that the show could easily resolve if it chose to. The ambiguity is maintained actively, against direct statements from the show's creator, because the writers understand that the mystery is doing something for the show that a definitive answer would undo. Now, bring the theories alongside the geography question and see what each of them makes of it. The radiation theory proposes something that is either a compelling framework or a piece of creative overreach, depending on how seriously you are willing to take it. If the plant's contamination can alter the biology of the people living in Springfield's environment, if it can produce four-fingered hands and yellow skin and superhuman resilience and suppressed cognitive function in the residents, why should the physical geography be exempt? If the contamination has rewritten the biological rules for living things in Springfield's vicinity, what would prevent it from rewriting physical geography as well? Under this reading, Springfield has mountains and ocean within driving distance because the contamination does not just affect biology, it warps the physical environment around it. The radiation has compressed geographic features that should be hundreds of miles apart into a single impossible region. The town exists in a space that has been distorted by the same force that distorted its residents, and the geographic impossibility is simply the environmental version of the biological impossibility that the show presents every week in the form of Homer's skull shape and everyone's extra yellow skin. This is a stretch. It requires extending the radiation theory beyond what the show explicitly supports and into interpretive territory that could accommodate almost anything. But it is internally consistent with the theory's broader logic, which is part of what makes it interesting to spend time inside. The coma theory makes the geographic question simple and devastating. Homer's dreaming brain does not have a precise map of the United States stored in a form accessible to the dreaming mind. It has emotional impressions and fragment memories, and pieces of places it has visited, or glimpsed, or half remembered from things it saw once and did not quite retain. Mountains from a vacation, ocean from a commercial that played in a hospital room, desert from a film he might have seen through the fog of unconsciousness, farmland from a drive he took at some point and the memory of which is incomplete. The dreaming mind assembled Springfield from every American landscape Homer ever experienced, or partially experienced, layering them without regard for geographic reality because dreams do not use maps. They use feelings. Springfield feels like America because it is built from Homer's feeling of America, from the emotional residue of everything American he ever absorbed, assembled in a space that obeys emotional logic rather than cartographic constraint. The show's most politically acute reading of the geography mystery comes from the framework established by the principal and the pauper. If Springfield operates through collective denial and the systematic suppression of inconvenient truths, then the town's refusal to have a fixed location is the ultimate structural expression of that principle. You cannot investigate a town you cannot find. If Springfield exists in a state of perpetual geographic ambiguity, floating between states without settling in any of them, then it also exists in a state of perpetual regulatory ambiguity. There is no fixed state attorney general with clear jurisdiction over Springfield's affairs. There is no consistent EPA regional office with established authority over the plant. There is no permanent regulatory relationship between the town's institutions and any particular state's oversight mechanisms because the town's relationship to any given state changes depending on which episode you are watching. The 342 violations have never been meaningfully remediated. The cracked cooling towers have never been repaired. The contaminated water supply has never been tested by an external authority with the power to compel remediation. Part of this is Burns's influence and money and political connections. But another part of it is that the jurisdictional question, which state's EPA, which state's attorney general, which regulatory body has the authority to act, is genuinely unresolved because the town is genuinely unlocated. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. Landing means accountability. Landing means an investigator from a specific agency shows up with a specific mandate and starts asking specific questions about what a nuclear plant with 342 violations has done to the population around it. Over 30 years, the geographic ambiguity is a legal shield built into the show's fundamental architecture. In a town where the most powerful man has spent decades poisoning the water supply and everyone has voted not to know it, Having a location that no regulatory body can definitively claim is exactly the kind of structural protection you would expect to find in place. A town that could be anywhere is a town that belongs to everyone, and a town that belongs to everyone can never be fully claimed by any single legal authority. Springfield is everywhere, and therefore nowhere that any specific set of rules applies to it. It will never be located, not because the show cannot decide, because the show decided long ago that locating Springfield is more dangerous than not locating it. For Springfield? For Burns? For the system that has been running inside Springfield since the plant was built? Let the town float. It always has, it always will. Section 10. The Floating Timeline and Why Nobody Ages. Bart Simpson was 10 years old in December 1989. He is 10 years old right now. 36 years have passed in the world outside the television, and Bart has not aged a single year. Lisa has been 8 since 1989. Maggie has been 1 since 1989. Homer and Marge looked in their mid-30s when the show premiered, and they look the same today. The industry has a name for this: floating timeline. It is a convention used by long-running animated shows that allows the characters to exist in whatever year the current episode is set in, without accumulating the years on their bodies. The technology around them updates. The cultural references reflect the current moment. The world they live in advances, but they do not advance with it. They are suspended at the ages they inhabited when the show began, moving through an ever-changing present in bodies that do not change. Most people accept this without needing to examine it. It is how animated shows work. It is a necessary convention for a show that intends to run indefinitely without facing the narrative problems that aging characters create. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has generated contradictions serious enough to require their own explanation. The conventions that manage the problem have started to crack under the pressure of 3.5 decades. The most visible strain is in the backstory. When the show began, Homer and Marge's history was firmly rooted in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school during a specific era. Their courtship was set against the cultural backdrop of that particular decade. The music, the fashion, the references they carried as shared memories, all of it was calibrated to the experience of people who had been teenagers in the late 70s. This was internally consistent for parents who were in their mid-30s during the late 1980s when the show premiered. But if Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they did not meet in 1978. They would have been born around 1990 and been teenagers in the mid-2000s. Their formative cultural experiences would not have been Watergate and disco and the aftermath of Vietnam. They would have been MySpace and early smartphones, and the specific texture of the early internet era. The show has made this adjustment multiple times across its run. Homer and Marge's backstory has been rewritten to reflect the floating present. Their origin story has been retold with their youth placed in progressively later decades. They have been depicted as products of the late 70s, then the late 80s, then the 90s, then the early 2000s. The love story between them is constant. The people they are to each other is constant. But the era of their meeting shifts forward every few years to maintain the arithmetic consistency of a floating timeline. This means Homer and Marge do not have a stable past. Their personal history is a draft that gets revised whenever the timeline demands it, and the previous version is simply abandoned without acknowledgement. They have whatever backstory is required to make the current episode work. When the next episode needs a different backstory, the old one is set aside. The characters' memories are unstable in a structural sense, and the show treats this as a production necessity rather than a narrative problem. Which it is until you start asking what it means within the logic of the theories that have been building around Springfield for decades. Now bring the theories in. The coma theory handles the aging freeze more elegantly than any other explanation the show or its commentators have produced. Nobody ages in The Simpsons because they exist inside the mind of a man who last saw them in April 1993 and has not seen them since. Homer's dreaming brain has no record of Bart at 11 or 14 or 25. It has Bart at 10 because that is the age Bart was when the vending machine fell. It has Lisa at 8 and Maggie at 1, and Marge as she looked on the last morning Homer was conscious. The dream does not age them because the dreamer has no material from which to imagine them older. Dreams hold things the way memory holds them. They preserve the version of people that was encoded at the moment of the last significant experience, and they do not automatically update those versions as time passes in the waking world. Homer's mind is running a simulation of his family built from the last moment he was present with them, and in the simulation they stay at those ages because those are the only ages his mind has the data to construct. The radiation theory has a different answer that is less emotionally devastating and more biologically specific. The contamination in Springfield's environment has altered the cellular biology of the residents in ways that affect the normal aging process. Whatever the nuclear material in the water and air has done to the bodies of the people living in the contamination zone, one of the things it has done is disrupted the mechanisms that normally cause a body to age visibly over time. The residents of Springfield look the same year after year because the contamination has interfered with the biological clock at the cellular level. The collective denial theory from the principal and the pauper offers the most socially acute reading. Springfield has voted, as it votes on everything that threatens the stability of its agreed-upon reality, to treat the passage of time as irrelevant. The same town that made it illegal to acknowledge that Armin Tamzarian was not Seymour Skinner has made it functionally illegal to notice that its residents have not aged in 36 years. Time passes. Nobody acknowledges that it passes in ways that matter. The social contract extends to include the passage of years among the things Springfield has decided not to observe. The Burns immortality theory adds a layer that the other theories do not. At least one person in Springfield has already demonstrated that the biological fact of aging is negotiable in this universe, that wealth and medical technology and the specific biological adaptations produced by weekly radiation treatments can sustain a person beyond the age at which normal biology would cease to function. If Burns can exist outside the normal rules of aging through artificial means, then the concept of aging as an inevitable biological process has already been shown to be conditional in this world. Springfield is a place where aging is possible for those who cannot afford to prevent it and manageable for those who can. All of these theories arrive at the same fundamental point from different directions. Time does not work in Springfield the way it works everywhere else. Something, whether it is radiation or coma or collective denial or the medical infrastructure of a very old and very wealthy man, has broken the normal relationship between Springfield and time. The characters are not aging because whatever has altered Springfield has also altered time's claim on the people living there. The floating timeline is not just a production convention. Under the weight of these theories, it is a symptom. It is the show telling you, in the structure of its storytelling, that these characters are trapped. They cannot advance. They cannot grow. They cycle through variations of the same lives, face the same categories of crisis, experience the same resets, without ever moving toward whatever conclusion time should eventually bring to every living thing. The show has imagined its characters aging. In a Season 6 episode called Lisa's Wedding, there is a flash forward to a future where Lisa is 23 years old, engaged to be married, living in a city where her intelligence is appreciated in ways Springfield never managed. The episode is specific and emotionally detailed in its portrait of who Lisa becomes. She is the person the show has always suggested she would be, intelligent and principled and a little lonely, searching for connection in a world that takes her seriously in ways her hometown never did. The episode proves that the show can imagine its characters growing up. It can envision the people they would become if time were allowed to pass. It can tell emotionally resonant stories about who they would be in a version of their lives where years had accumulated and left their marks. But the future closes at the end of that episode. Lisa returns to being 8, Bart returns to being 10. The window shuts and the permanent present resumes, as if the glimpse through it had not occurred. The show can imagine growth. It refuses to allow it. And this refusal is the heart of the floating timeline, and it says something that goes beyond The Simpsons specifically. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie are the American family, not one American family among many. The American family, in the sense that for 36 years, across the entire span of the lives of a significant portion of their audience, they have been the household that sits at the center of American cultural self-understanding. They have outlasted every other fictional family in the history of the medium. They have been present for more of American life, more of American political history, more of the American conversation about what family means and what it costs and what it is worth than any other fictional characters television has ever produced. And the American family, as The Simpsons has constructed it across 36 years, cannot be allowed to change. The structure must hold. Homer must be middle-aged and bumbling. Marge must be patient and holding things together. Bart must be rebellious and 10. Lisa must be idealistic and 8. Maggie must be watching and waiting and won. Because the moment The Simpsons ages, the moment Bart goes to college and Lisa moves somewhere that actually deserves her, and Maggie starts speaking in full sentences, and Homer retires, and Marge is left in a quieter house, the show becomes something different, something harder. An elegy for a family that ran out of what it had always seemed to have in inexhaustible supply, which is time. And American culture, which has been using this family as a mirror and a comfort and a reference point for going on 4 decades, does not want that story. It wants the other one. The one where the kids are always young and the parents are always there, and the house on Evergreen Terrace always looks the same, and the beer is always cold in the fridge, and nobody ever has to say anything that sounds like goodbye. The floating timeline is the show's thesis statement. The Simpsons are frozen in time because we need them to be, because they represent something we cannot afford to let dissolve. The messy, imperfect, chaotic, loudly loving American family. The family that survives everything, and recovers from everything, and resets after every catastrophe, and starts fresh every week on the same couch, in the same living room, in the same town, that cannot be located on any map. They do not age because aging means ending. The American family is not allowed to end. The loop is not their prison, it is ours. We built it, we maintain it. We tune in every week to confirm that the walls are still standing, and the family is still intact, and the timeline is still floating. And every time we watch, every time we laugh, every time we quote a line that first aired in a decade we were children in or a decade before we were born, we add another layer to the loop and make it a little harder for time to get in. Bart will be 10 forever because we need him to be. Lisa will be 8 forever because the alternative, Lisa at 30, looking back at all the years that have passed and all the idealism that has been tested by a world more complicated than she imagined it would be, is a story we are not ready to receive. And somewhere in Springfield, which is everywhere and nowhere, Homer is either dreaming or waking or suspended in the borderland between the two. The cooling towers are releasing their steam into the dark. Burns is keeping his weekly appointment. Maggie is watching everything with enormous patient eyes and saying nothing and waiting for the moment she has decided is right. The real Seymour Skinner is wherever the train took him, carrying his truth in a town that made truth illegal. Mona Simpson is gone in the way that nothing in Springfield is usually allowed to be gone, really and finally and without a reset. And the family is on the couch. They are always on the couch. The couch gag plays every week and deposits them there, together, in the living room of the house on Evergreen Terrace. And then the episode begins and runs its course and ends. And next week they are back on the couch again. The same people. The same couch. The same house. The same town. The loop that we pressed pause on in 1989 and have never pressed play on since. If the coma theory is true, then the loop is Homer's greatest gift to himself. A world he constructed from the materials of his last conscious moment, held in place by a dreaming mind that refuses to let it move, sustained by whatever remains of the electrical activity in a brain that has been slowly losing function for 30 years. A house where the kids are always young and Marge is always there and the beer is always cold. A heaven built to the specific dimensions of what a man like Homer Simpson would most want to be true. Every time the credits roll, every time everything resets, every time the next episode begins with Homer stumbling through the door and the family intact, that is not lazy writing. That is the dreaming mind refusing to let the story end. Because ending the story means facing what comes after the story. And what comes after the story might be a hospital room and a question Homer is not ready to have answered. The show will not confirm this, it will not deny it. It will run another season and then another, and keep depositing the family on the couch each week, and we will keep watching because we cannot quite let them go either. Because they are us. Because Springfield is our town. Because Homer is the father we recognize, and Marge is the patience that holds things together, and Bart is who we wanted to be at 10, and Lisa is who we knew we should have been. And Maggie is the part of us that is watching everything and saying nothing and waiting for the right moment to finally speak. Or maybe it is simpler than all of this. Maybe we cannot let them go because they are frozen in a time that we are not. Because Bart is still 10 while we are whatever age we are now. Because the Springfield of the couch gag and the opening credits exists in the permanent unchanging present while we keep moving through time in the ordinary way, adding years and losing things and becoming people who are noticeably different from who we were when we first sat down to watch, as long as the show runs, as long as the loop keeps floating, As long as Homer comes home at 5:30 and Marge is in the kitchen and the kids are somewhere in the house doing whatever children do in cartoon houses, we have a place to go that does not change. A home that is always exactly what it was. A family that is always intact. A couch that is always there. Springfield is the town that will not let us age either. Not while we are watching, not while we are in it, not while the timer in the corner counts down to the next episode and the next one and the next one. And maybe that is the real conspiracy. Not the radiation, or the coma, or the unsolved shooting, or the immortal billionaire, or the silent genius, or the exiled truth. The real conspiracy is the one we are all running on each other. The show stays frozen and we keep watching, and as long as we keep watching, we have a reason to pretend that the years are not passing as fast as they are. That the couch we sat on as kids is not gone. That we are not noticeably older. That something, somewhere, is exactly as it was. Springfield does not change. For all the theories and all the evidence and all the dark corridors we have explored tonight, that is the thing we are really protecting when we keep the loop running. Something that stays exactly as it was. Sleep well. The cooling towers will still be there when you wake up. Springfield always is. That is the whole point. That is the only thing it has ever needed to be. Good night. Outro. We have spent a long time in Springfield tonight. We followed the radiation from the cracked cooling towers into the bodies of the people living around them. We stayed with Homer in the hospital room and listened to the dream he has been running since April 1993. We opened the Burns shooting case again and sat with all the evidence that the official answer does not cleanly account for. We traced Burns's impossible survival through a century of weekly treatments and managed diseases and the infrastructure of a billionaire dedicated entirely to not dying. We watched Maggie through the wide, dark eyes that see everything and disclose nothing. We walked into the school ceremony where an entire town voted to make truth illegal and exile the man who carried it. We followed Mona Simpson underground and traced the line from her disappearance back to Homer's crayon and forward to the shape of his whole life. We cataloged the predictions that came true and the thousands that did not, and the confirmation bias that turns a large enough body of satirical work into something that looks like prophecy. We tried to find Springfield on the map and found it everywhere and nowhere. And we stared at the floating timeline until the loop stared back. Every theory arrives at the same conclusion from a different direction. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something structural, something deliberate, something woven into the fabric of the town at a level that the residents cannot see because they are inside it, and the audience cannot quite see because we have been watching it for so long that it has become normal. But the show has been telling you about it since 1989, not through exposition or dramatic reveals, through accumulation, through the patient layering of detail on detail on detail across 800 episodes, until the picture that forms is undeniable. And now you know what to look for the next time you turn it on. Good night. Sleep well. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. Expansion passages to be woven into each section. Expansion for Section 1. The nuclear power plant. After the violations passage, before the Homer paragraph, there is something specific about the way the show handles the plant's danger that is worth dwelling on, because it is not what you would expect from a show that wanted to present these violations as comedy. When the show depicts the plant's safety problems, it does not use the soft focus language of corporate negligence. It uses precise, observable details. The waste is dumped into specific bodies of water with specific proximity to the town. The playground where radioactive material is left is a place where actual children in the show are depicted playing. The cooling tower patches are visible, depicted with a specificity that suggests the writers wanted the audience to register them rather than simply laugh at the absurdity of their existence. The show is not treating these violations as abstract background world building. It is treating them as a documented record. And the documentation is so consistent across so many episodes and so many years that the cumulative picture it draws is not the portrait of a comedically incompetent facility, but the portrait of a facility that has been systematically harmful to its surrounding environment for decades, with the knowledge and authorization of its owner. Homer's role as safety inspector takes on a different quality when you examine the specific nature of his failures. He does not fail in ways that suggest someone trying and falling short. He fails in ways that suggest someone who has never fully oriented toward the task. He is not a safety inspector who is too dumb to find the violations. He is a safety inspector who is not engaged with the concept of safety inspection as a meaningful professional activity. The violations continue not because Homer cannot see them, but because Homer has never been oriented toward the goal of addressing them. This is consistent with the theory that Burns hired Homer not despite his incompetence, but because of it. An incompetent safety inspector does not need to be directed to ignore violations. He ignores them automatically through his general relationship with professional responsibility. He is the perfect, plausible deniability. If anyone ever questions why the violations have continued for so long, Burns can point to the safety inspector. He had someone in the role. He followed the regulatory requirement. What that person did or failed to do is that person's professional failure. The three-eyed fish offers a window into how Springfield processes environmental evidence, and the processing pattern is worth slowing down for. Blinky is found. Blinky is immediately understood by people outside Springfield, by the gubernatorial candidate who uses him as the centerpiece of an environmental platform, as evidence of exactly what any person with basic environmental science literacy would understand him to be. He is a mutation. He is the visible manifestation of a contaminated ecosystem. His third eye is a biological marker for what happens to living organisms when they develop in proximity to radioactive contamination at levels above what their biology is equipped to manage. The candidate's argument is simple and follows directly from the evidence. A fish pulled from a river downstream of a nuclear facility has three eyes. Nuclear contamination causes genetic mutations in developing organisms. Therefore, the nuclear facility is contaminating the river. This is not a complicated chain of reasoning. It is the direct application of basic ecological logic to a visible piece of evidence. And Springfield's response is to watch Burns eat the fish on television and be satisfied that the matter is resolved. The show is depicting a population that has lost the capacity for sustained critical engagement with evidence, not because the residents are stupid in the ordinary sense, but because something has happened to the way they process information about their environment. They can see the evidence, they can hear the argument, and then the chain of reasoning collapses somewhere between the initial reception of the information and the sustained engagement that would turn that information into action. This is consistent with chronic neurological exposure to environmental contaminants, affecting the cognitive architecture responsible for sustained reasoning and long-term planning. The specific kind of impairment that chronic low-level radiation exposure can produce in a population is not a dramatic deterioration that would be immediately visible. It is a subtle alteration of the capacities responsible for connecting current observations to past patterns and future consequences. The fish has a third eye, and Burns ate the fish on television, and somehow those two facts never connect into the sustained inquiry that would logically follow from them. The Simpsons movie provides a useful thought experiment for what it would take to force Springfield to reckon with its contamination. The answer is that nothing less than physical containment by the federal government would do it. The town had to be sealed under a dome before the reality of its situation became impossible to manage through the normal mechanisms of collective denial. And even then, the response of most residents was not to examine the contamination that had made containment necessary. It was to respond to the situation imposed on them without engaging with the question of what had made that situation necessary. Additional passage: the Burns connection. There is a scene in an earlier part of the show's run where Burns visits the power plant's waste disposal area and watches his workers dump radioactive material into a river with the casual indifference of someone watching a routine administrative procedure. He does not look troubled. He does not look conflicted. He watches the glowing waste enter the water with the expression of a man who has settled a question so thoroughly in his own mind that it no longer generates any particular emotional response. The question Burns has settled is whether what happens to the people downstream is worth considering in the calculation of his business operations. He has answered it definitively: it is not. The people downstream are part of the environment Burns operates in, and the environment is a resource, and resources exist to be used in the service of the operations that Burns has determined are the point of his existence. This is not portrayed as villainous in the conventional sense. The show does not give Burns a mustache to twirl or a monologue explaining his contempt for the residents of Springfield. What it gives him is something more unsettling than explicit villainy. It gives him the complete absence of awareness that any other consideration should be factored in. Burns does not consider the people downstream, because people downstream are not part of the category of things Burns has ever learned to consider. They are externalities in a system he designed, and the system was not designed to account for them. This matters for the radiation theory because it establishes that the contamination of Springfield is not accidental. It is not the result of negligence in the sense of something falling through the cracks of a system that was trying to prevent it. It is the result of a system that was never designed to prevent it, operated by a person who has never experienced the contamination as something that matters. In a context where the person experiencing the contamination, the population of Springfield, has been systematically prevented from demanding accountability for it. The radiation theory is not a conspiracy theory in the sense of proposing a secret plan that no one knows about. Burns knows about it. The show makes this explicit. The conspiracy is not that the contamination is happening. It is that the contamination is not being remediated. And the reason it is not being remediated is not that no one knows. It is that the person with the power and the obligation to remediate it has made a settled calculation that he is not going to. Expansion for Section 2. The Homer Coma Theory. After the God conversation passage, before the aging problem, there is another piece of evidence for the coma theory that concerns the structure of the episodes themselves rather than any specific plot point. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a show that maintained continuity in a specific way. Consequences from one episode would occasionally echo into later episodes. Characters would reference things that had happened in the past. The town had a sense of accumulated history that the audience could feel even without being able to reconstruct it episode by episode. After the coma, the show began to operate differently. Each episode became more thoroughly self-contained. The reset between episodes became more complete. Events that should have permanently altered the characters or the town would simply vanish from the characters' awareness by the following week. Catastrophic things happened and were forgotten. Revelations occurred and were not integrated. The world the show depicted after the coma had a quality of perpetual freshness that felt increasingly disconnected from the weight that time should have deposited on people and places that had been through what Springfield and its residents had been through. The coma theory explains this structural shift in the show's storytelling. A dreaming mind does not maintain continuity between dream cycles, in the way that waking consciousness maintains continuity across days. Each dream begins from a kind of baseline. The events of the previous dream do not automatically carry forward as lived experience that the dreamer must process and integrate. The dream can reference those events but is not required to be shaped by them in the way that waking experience is shaped by its own history. The Simpsons After the Coma is a show that runs on dream logic. Events can happen without fully accumulating. The world can be altered and then restored to its baseline without anyone having to account for how the restoration occurred. The characters can experience things that should change them, and then appear, in the following episode, not to have been changed. This is not poor writing. This is the structure of dreaming. The specific way the show handles its recurring guest characters also fits the framework in an interesting way. When the show was in its earlier seasons, before the coma, guest appearances tended to be integrated into the episodes with some narrative logic. The guests were there because the story required them. They served functions within the plot that a fictional character could not serve as effectively. After the coma, guest appearances began to accumulate in ways that sometimes felt disconnected from narrative necessity. Celebrities appeared in Springfield because they are celebrities, because Homer's dreaming mind has absorbed their names and faces from the media environment of the hospital room, not because the story specifically required their particular talents or attributes. The celebrity was the point, more than the role the celebrity was serving. This is consistent with the way a dreaming brain that is losing organizational capacity begins to populate its dream world. In the early stages, the dream is driven by internal logic and emotional material. Later, as the organizational capacity degrades, the dream increasingly draws on external stimuli, processing the sounds and fragments it receives from the waking world and incorporating them as characters or elements within the dream's ongoing narrative. The celebrities in later seasons of The Simpsons are, under this reading, the names Homer's brain picks up from the hospital room's ambient media environment and translates into Springfield residents. His dreaming mind is not generating these characters from his own imagination. It is recognizing fragments from outside and using them as building material for the dream it cannot stop running. Additional passage. The emotional core of the coma theory. If you stay with the coma theory long enough, you arrive at the emotional question that underlies all the structural and narrative evidence. What does it mean for the show you have been watching if Homer has been unconscious since 1993? The conventional answer people reach for is that it makes the show sad. It turns a comedy into a tragedy. The adventures and the gags and the guest appearances and the annual Halloween special are revealed to be the increasingly desperate imaginings of a man who cannot wake up. The comedy was never comedy. It was a man's mind trying to maintain the experience of his own life in the absence of the capacity to live it. But there is another reading that does not treat the coma as a darkening of the show's meaning. There is a reading that treats it as a deepening. Homer's central wish, the thing that organizes every episode if you step back far enough to see it, is simple. He wants his family, not in any complicated philosophical sense. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his difficult, alive, mischievous boy. He wants Lisa to still play her saxophone and challenge him with ideas that are too complicated for him to follow, but that he loves her for having. He wants Maggie to still be small enough that he can hold her in one arm. He wants Friday evening in the house on Evergreen Terrace to last. That is what he wants. That is what the dream gives him. The coma does not make The Simpsons a tragedy. The coma makes every episode a sustained act of love. A man in a hospital bed dreaming about his family because his family is the only thing he has ever truly wanted and the only thing the dream can still give him. He cannot reach them. He cannot speak to them or hold them or be there for the moments that are happening without him. But he can dream them. He can keep them in the place where he last had them, unchanged and present, and his, every time Homer survives something impossible, every time the world resets, every time the credits roll and the family is still intact and the house is still standing and everything is back the way it was, that is Homer's mind refusing to let go of the only thing it has ever really held. It is not sad. It is the most human thing the show has ever depicted. It is a man who loves his family so much that even a coma cannot separate him from them for long. Expansion for Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? After the gun holster passage, the timeline of events on the night of the shooting is worth reconstructing carefully, because the reconstruction reveals gaps that the official account does not address. The town meeting ended. Burns was shot somewhere in the vicinity of the town's sundial, which is in a public space. Multiple people were in the area or had been in the area moments before. The parking lot where Burns supposedly encountered Maggie was adjacent to the meeting space. Burns was shot with his own gun, which means the gun had been removed from his person at some point before the shooting. When was it removed? The holster was empty before Burns arrived at the sundial, which means the gun was taken from him inside or very near the meeting. The meeting was crowded. Dozens of people were present, many of them angry, some of them armed with their own weapons. In that environment, removing a gun from someone's holster without them noticing is not a task that requires extraordinary skill. It requires proximity, a moment of distraction, and hands that are quick enough to take advantage of the opportunity. A baby in a parking lot, at the end of a meeting, encountering a man who is still holstered, would need to wait for the gun to fall on its own during a struggle. A person at the meeting would have had multiple opportunities to take the gun before Burns left the building. The sequence of events that Burns describes in his testimony, which was delivered from a hospital bed after a period of unconsciousness, involves a struggle over a lollipop that somehow results in the gun falling from a holster that was already confirmed to be empty before Burns reached the parking lot. This is a timeline problem. The holster was empty before the parking lot. Burns describes the gun falling in the parking lot. These two facts are difficult to reconcile. The most natural explanation is that the gun was taken from Burns inside the meeting or immediately after, by someone who then followed Burns to the parking lot or was already there when he arrived. Someone who was not Maggie, because Maggie would not have had access to Burns's holster during a town meeting she was not attending in the way that the adult attendees were. The alternate endings that were produced and then set aside are a window into the writer's uncertainty about their own solution. A complete Smithers ending was animated and voiced. A Barney Gumble ending was written and considered seriously enough to be developed toward production. These were not throwaway brainstorming ideas. They were finished or near-finished creative products that were set aside when the writers settled on Maggie as their answer. What this means is that the mystery's answer was not determined by the clues. The clues were adjusted after the answer was chosen. The show worked backward from the conclusion to the evidence, which is the reverse of how a fairly constructed mystery operates. The contest invited viewers to solve it forward, from evidence to conclusion, but the writers had constructed it backward, which is why nobody in the contest sample got it right. You cannot solve forward a mystery that was constructed backward, because the connection between the evidence and the conclusion was assembled after the conclusion was already decided. Additional passage. The meaning of the final shot. The final image of the episode has been analyzed extensively, and most analyses arrive at the same place. Maggie, alone in an empty room, checking to confirm she is unobserved, then mimicking gunfire with her pacifier. The show wants you to read this as a confession, as the baby knowing what she did and privately savoring it or processing it or commemorating it. But consider the alternative reading seriously for a moment. Maggie was in the parking lot, according to Burns's testimony. She was in the vicinity of the shooting regardless of whether she pulled the trigger. She was present for the event. She saw what happened. And now, alone in a room, she is doing what very young children do when they encounter something significant. She is reenacting it. Babies and toddlers learn about the world through imitation. They repeat what they observe. They reproduce actions they have witnessed, not because they understand those actions fully, but because imitation is the primary tool their developing minds use to process experience. Maggie saw someone shoot Mr. Burns. In the privacy of an empty room, she is reenacting what she saw. The checking to see if she is being watched element is the part that does not fit simple childhood imitation. Normal imitating behavior in infants does not involve surveillance of the social environment. But we have already established, across the broader body of evidence about Maggie's capabilities, that she is not operating within the normal developmental parameters for her age. She has demonstrated situational awareness and strategic concealment that are not consistent with typical infant behavior. The fact that she checks whether she is being watched before performing the gesture is consistent with what the show has established about her character. What she is checking for is whether the gesture will be seen. Why would the gesture be something that should not be seen? If she is the shooter, the answer is obvious. She is aware that the gesture implicates her and does not want to perform it in front of witnesses. But if she saw someone else shoot Burns, she might also be concealing her memory of the event, because she has observed, in the weeks since the shooting, that the memory is dangerous to display. She saw an adult do something significant. She observed the subsequent investigation. She observed Homer being arrested. She observed Burns's testimony and the way it resolved the case. A mind as sophisticated as Maggie's, observing all of this, might correctly conclude that her own first-hand memory of the shooting is something to conceal rather than display. In this reading, she is not confessing. She is being careful with evidence she has, which, given the environment she is operating in, is exactly the correct response. Expansion for Section 4. Mr. Burns and Immortality. After the Smithers passage, the question of what happens to Burns's medical regimen if something disrupts Smithers's availability is one the show has explored in episodes where Smithers is absent or incapacitated. What those episodes reveal, consistently, is that Burns is helpless in ways that go far beyond the logistical inconveniences of someone who has lost their administrative support. When Smithers takes a vacation, Burns cannot manage his own correspondence. He cannot remember where his various medications are kept. He cannot execute the simplest practical tasks of daily life without assistance. This is depicted as comedy about a man so accustomed to being served that he has lost the capacity for self-sufficiency. But it is also a description of someone whose survival is dependent on the continued functioning of an external system of support that he cannot replicate independently. Burns has been kept alive for over a century, and the cost of that sustained survival is that he has never needed to maintain the internal resources that self-sufficiency requires. Smithers handles everything. Smithers has always handled everything, and the things Smithers handles have come to include, over time, things that are not merely conveniences but necessities. The treatment schedule, the medication management, the monitoring of Burns's condition that allows interventions to occur before the deterioration that would follow a missed dose has progressed to the point of crisis. Take Smithers away, and Burns has no backup system. There is no redundancy. There is no second person who understands the protocol or knows where the materials are kept or can step in when the primary caregiver is unavailable. The most powerful man in Springfield has organized his continued existence around a dependency on a single other person that, if that person were unavailable for any sustained period, would be fatal. This is interesting because it suggests that Burns's immortality is more fragile than his power, and his wealth and his apparent permanence would imply. He is not simply too rich to die. He is too dependent on a specific individual to survive without that individual. Smithers is not just Burns's assistant. He is Burns's life support system, wearing a business suit and delivering memos. Additional passage, historical dimension. The full scope of Burns's historical experience, laid out in cumulative detail, is disorienting in the specific way that things become disorienting when they are too large to hold in the mind all at once. Consider the span of history he has lived through with conscious adult awareness. He was an adult during the Gilded Age, during the Progressive Era, through 2 world wars, through the Great Depression, through the Cold War, through the technological revolution of the late 20th century, and now through the digital age of the 21st. He has watched America become something fundamentally different from what it was when he first acquired power, while maintaining his position across all of those transformations. The adaptability this requires is itself remarkable. Each era has different economic structures, different legal frameworks, different technological capabilities, different social norms about what the wealthy can do and what accountability looks like. Burns has navigated every one of these transitions without losing his position or his power. He has not merely survived the transformations. He has maintained advantage across them, which requires not just longevity but the sustained capacity to understand new environments and position himself advantageously within them. This is either the greatest run of institutional adaptability in American history, or it suggests that something about Burns's position has made him somewhat immune to the forces that normally disrupt entrenched power. His monopoly on Springfield's electricity supply gives him a kind of leverage that is difficult to dislodge through normal economic competition. You cannot compete with the person who controls the only power plant. You can only try to regulate them, and we have established the challenges that regulatory accountability faces in a town whose location is perpetually ambiguous. Burns has simply outlasted everything that might have disrupted him. He has outlasted the politicians who might have challenged him, the competitors who might have undercut him, the regulatory environments that might have constrained him. He has outlasted them all because he has lived longer than they have, and living longer in a position of power is itself a form of winning. Expansion for Section 5. The Maggie Simpson Theory. After the Lisa comparison, there is an episode that most Simpsons fans remember primarily for a celebrity voice and a surprisingly moving ending, but which is actually the clearest statement of the Maggie theory the show has ever produced. It is an episode in which Homer, separated from his family for reasons specific to that episode's plot, finds himself particularly conscious of what Maggie means to him and what she might become. In the episode, Homer has a conversation about Maggie with someone who knows her, and what emerges from that conversation is the specific quality of attention that people who have actually spent time with Maggie tend to develop. They notice that she is not what she appears to be. They notice that behind the passivity and the silence and the pacifier, something is engaged. Something is watching and processing and responding to what it observes in ways that are not consistent with the normal developmental profile of a child her age. Homer, characteristically, does not fully absorb this. The information passes through his cognitive architecture without producing the sustained integration that would change his understanding of his youngest child. But the viewer absorbs it, and the viewer has the cumulative evidence of everything the show has established about Maggie's capabilities across dozens of episodes. The question the episode raises without naming it explicitly is this: what is Maggie waiting for? Not in the sense of what she is waiting to do, though that is part of it. In the sense of what she is waiting to see. What set of conditions would Maggie decide constitutes the right moment to stop performing passivity and reveal what she actually is? The theory that has developed around this question proposes that what Maggie is waiting for is a situation that her intervention can genuinely change. The Burns shooting, if she was responsible for it, was a situation she assessed and acted on. The daycare rebellion was a situation she assessed and responded to. Every time Maggie has acted with her full capability, there has been something specific at stake that her capabilities were uniquely suited to address. What she is waiting for is the moment when the scale of the problem is large enough and her capabilities are the right tool for addressing it. Maggie is not holding back out of modesty or caution. She is holding back because she understands that revealing what she can do has costs, and she will not pay those costs for a problem that does not require what she has. Additional passage. The silence as strategy conclusion. There is one more dimension of Maggie's silence that is worth sitting with before we move on, and it concerns the relationship between visibility and vulnerability. In Springfield, visibility is dangerous. The people who are most visible in the town are the people who are most subject to the forces that operate there. Homer is visible, And what that visibility has cost him is his mother and his intelligence and his capacity for the kind of sustained critical thinking that might have led him out of the trap he has been living in since childhood. Lisa is visible, and what her visibility costs her is constant. She is seen, constantly and specifically, and being seen by Springfield means being dismissed by Springfield, being treated as a problem to manage rather than a perspective to take seriously. The people in Springfield who have maintained anything resembling freedom of action are the people who have managed to remain unseen. Mona Simpson operated underground for 27 years because the moment she was seen by the right person, her freedom ended. The real Seymour Skinner was exiled the moment he became too visible in his own life. Burns himself operates from behind layers of insulation, visible in the abstract as the most powerful man in Springfield but personally inaccessible, protected from the consequences of visibility by the distance wealth provides. Maggie has studied the relationship between visibility and vulnerability in Springfield her entire life. She has observed how the visible people fare. She has made a decision that is, within the specific environment of Springfield, the most intelligent decision available to her. She stays unseen. She stays below the threshold of attention. She accumulates capability and knowledge and observational data without surfacing any of it in ways that would make her a target for the management that Springfield applies to anything it finds threatening. And somewhere behind that pacifier, behind those enormous eyes, behind 36 years of perfect strategic invisibility, she is the most informed person in Springfield. She has seen everything. She has heard everything. She has understood everything. And she has said nothing. Which means when she decides to act, she will be acting with more complete information about the situation in Springfield than anyone else in the town possesses, including Burns. Expansion for Section 6. The Principal and the Imposter. After the Judge Snyder decree passage, the specific legal language of Judge Snyder's decree is worth considering for a moment because it does something unusual. It does not simply rule on a legal dispute in the normal way that legal disputes are ruled on. It creates a new legal reality that directly contradicts verifiable physical fact. The real Seymour Skinner is a living person. He is standing in the courtroom. He has documentation of his identity, his military record, his service history. He exists in a form that is physically and documentarily verifiable. And the judge's decree states, with the force of law, that he is not who he is. That the man whose face and name and documented history belong to him is not actually him. That his identity belongs legally and officially to someone else. This is not legal precedent in any recognizable sense. Courts resolve disputes about who has rights to particular resources or relationships. They do not create legal fictions that override physical reality and compel reality to conform to the fiction. What Judge Snyder does in this scene is not a legal ruling. It is a community performing its fundamental operational logic through the mechanism of legal authority. Springfield needed to make the lie official. Informal collective agreement was not enough. The lie needed the weight of legal force behind it because the truth, in the form of the real Seymour Skinner, was too physically present to be managed through informal social pressure alone. You cannot simply ignore a man who is standing in your courtroom and asserting his identity. You have to do something with him. The legal decree gave Springfield something to do with him. It sentenced him to exile. And the exile is specifically and literally physical. He is put on a train. He is removed from the geographic space of Springfield. His physical presence in the town is ended. The truth that he carried is removed from proximity. The lie can be maintained more easily once the truth is in another location. This physical removal of the truth is the most explicit expression in the show's history of how Springfield operates. Normally, the removal is figurative. Normally, the mechanism is social rather than legal. When uncomfortable truths arise in Springfield, they do not typically require legal decrees because the informal social mechanisms are sufficient to ensure that the truth does not become too entrenched to manage. People simply fail to think about the thing that the truth would make them think about. The chain of reasoning collapses somewhere before it reaches its conclusion. The subject changes. The episode ends. The principal and the pauper required a legal decree because the truth in this case was stubbornly physical. The real Seymour Skinner was a human being who could articulate his own identity and document it and stand there and insist on it in ways that social pressure alone could not adequately address. So Springfield deployed its most powerful tool, the formal authority of the law, and used it to accomplish what informal mechanisms usually accomplish without help: the exile. After the coma theory connection, there is something almost tender about the coma theory's reading of the Armin Tamzarian episode, once you sit with it. If Homer is dreaming, then he invented the entire scenario. He invented Armin Tamzarian. He invented the real Seymour Skinner. He invented the town meeting and the vote and the judge's decree and the train. He wrote a dream in which an entire community decided that a fiction, sincerely inhabited and well-maintained, was more legitimate than the original it had replaced. And the reason Homer's dreaming mind would construct this scenario, the reason this specific narrative would emerge from the unconscious processing of a man in a coma, is that it expresses something Homer needs to believe. Homer's coma is a fiction standing in for his real life. The dream of Homer Simpson, stumbling through Springfield and loving his family and surviving the impossible, is a fiction that has been sustained by the dreaming mind long enough that it has developed its own coherence and its own history. It is Armin Tamzarian. It is an imposter that has been in the role long enough to become, in every practical sense, real. And what Homer's dreaming mind needed to demonstrate, in this episode, is that this kind of substitution can be made legitimate, that a community can vote to accept the fiction in place of the fact, that the imposter can be recognized as the true version if enough people agree that he is. Homer's coma dream is not lying to him. It is telling him the truth in the only way it knows how. The truth is that the life he is dreaming is not his actual life. The truth is that the Homer who is alive in Springfield is an imposter standing in the place of the Homer who is lying in a hospital bed. And the truth, also, is that if everyone in Springfield agrees to treat the imposter as real, the imposter can be real enough. The exile of the original from the town's awareness is what makes the fiction viable. The real Seymour Skinner is exiled so that Armin Tamzarian can be Seymour Skinner. The real Homer is absent from the dream so that the dream Homer can be Homer. The mechanism is the same. The exile of the original is what makes space for the substitute, and Springfield votes for the substitute every single week. Expansion for Section 7. Mona Simpson and the Burns Conspiracy. After the biological weapons lab revelation, the detail about Burns owning a biological weapons laboratory deserves more attention than it typically receives, because it fundamentally expands the picture of what Burns has been doing in Springfield and for how long. The conventional image of Burns, even within the radiation theory framework, is of a man whose primary instrument of harm is his nuclear plant. The plant is the source of the contamination. The plant is the mechanism through which Burns maintains his control over Springfield's energy supply and its economic life. The plant is the visible, centrally located evidence of his power and his indifference to the harm his power causes. But Burns also owned a germ warfare laboratory. He was manufacturing biological weapons in the same town where the nuclear plant was located. This is not a historical footnote about something from long before the show's present. Mona's raid on the facility occurred in 1969. The show takes place in the 1980s and 1990s and beyond. The raid destroyed the specific contents of the facility, but it did not destroy the facility itself, or the knowledge base, or the organizational capacity that produced it. Burns rebuilt his plants after other setbacks. There is no particular reason to believe that one raid in 1969 permanently ended his interest in biological research. The pattern this establishes is important. Burns is not simply a man who owns a nuclear plant and has been negligent about its safety standards. Burns is a man who has historically been willing to develop weapons of mass destruction in a residential community when the weapons in question served his purposes. He has been willing to manufacture pathogens in proximity to schools and homes and the ordinary infrastructure of civilian life, not because he was unaware of the implications, but because the implications were irrelevant to the calculation he was making. This expands the scope of what Burns is and what he has been willing to do. The nuclear plant's violations are not the product of negligence. They are the product of a settled indifference to the harm that his operations caused to the people around them. And that indifference was present and operative at least since 1969, when he was running a biological weapons lab in the same town where the nuclear plant would later be built. Mona discovered this and acted on it. Her decision to join the raid was not idealism divorced from evidence. She had evidence of a specific and serious harm, and she responded to it in the most direct way available to her. She was wrong to stop and help Burns when he fell. That was the error that cost her everything. But the decision that put her in a position to make that error was not wrong. The weapons were real. The facility was real. The harm it represented was real. She stopped it, and Burns used the resources and the connections of his wealth to ensure that she would pay for that decision for the rest of her life. After the Abe deal passage, the full picture of what the deal between Abe and Burns means for Homer's life is worth assembling carefully because the pieces of it are distributed across different seasons and different episodes in ways that prevent the whole from being visible until you have collected all the parts. Abe knew that Burns had committed a crime. We know this because the deal required his silence about the crime. The crime is not specified in the episode that reveals the deal, which is frustrating but perhaps intentional. The show does not tell you what Burns did, because knowing the specific crime is not necessary to understand the deal. What matters is that Burns was vulnerable, and Abe had the evidence of that vulnerability, and rather than use the evidence to pursue accountability, Abe traded it for a job guarantee for his son. This is a choice that is comprehensible on its own terms. Abe was an old man with a son who struggled professionally, living in a town where Burns controlled most of the meaningful employment opportunities. The leverage Abe had over Burns was a one-time resource that would lose its value the moment it was deployed, either through legal action that Burns's wealth and connections might have blocked anyway, or through public disclosure that might not have produced the consequences Abe hoped for. Trading that leverage for a guaranteed job for Homer was a practical calculation. It was the choice of a man who had been around long enough to know how things worked in Springfield and to accept that this was how things worked. But the consequences of that choice for Homer are enormous and invisible and have been shaping his life from the moment the deal was made. Homer works at the plant not because it is the best option available to him, but because his grandfather made a deal that put him there and kept him there, regardless of what he did or failed to do. His employment is protected by an agreement he does not know exists. His incompetence has no professional consequences because the agreement prevents those consequences from operating. He is, in a very specific and contractual sense, trapped, not by the poverty of options that normally traps people in jobs that harm them, by a private deal made between a dead man and the man who signs his checks. And the harm that the plant does to Homer, the radiation exposure, the cognitive erosion of working in proximity to an active nuclear facility with 342 violations, the daily immersion in an environment that has been gradually altering his biology for decades, none of this produces the professional consequences that would normally lead a person to leave. Because the professional consequences of his performance have been suspended by a contract he does not know about, Homer cannot leave the plant. He is too damaged by it to make the decision to leave, and even if he made that decision, the deal would bring him back. Burns has a contractual obligation to keep Homer employed and the power to fulfill that obligation regardless of what Homer does. Homer is trapped in the plant from above by the contract and from inside by the damage the plant has done to the capacity for sustained decision-making that leaving would require. Burns did not trap Homer maliciously, in the sense of deliberately designing Homer's imprisonment as a goal in itself. He trapped Homer as a side effect of trapping Homer's grandfather's silence. But the result is the same. Homer has been in Sector 7G his entire adult life, and he will stay there, and the radiation will keep leaking, and the violations will keep continuing, and Burns will keep his weekly appointments, and Springfield will keep going exactly as it has always gone, because the system is self-sustaining, and Homer is one of the mechanisms through which it sustains itself. Expansion for Section 8. The Simpsons predictions. After the confirmation bias passage, there is a version of the prediction phenomenon that the debunkers do not address, not because they are wrong about the statistics and the bias, but because it operates at a different level from the one they are analyzing. The Simpsons has been running long enough and has been embedded deeply enough in American cultural life that its relationship to the culture it depicts has changed over time. In the early seasons, the show was observing American culture and satirizing what it observed. It was a mirror. It showed you the thing and then exaggerated it slightly to reveal the shape of the original more clearly. But 36 years of doing this, with this particular level of cultural penetration, at this particular scale of reach, changes the mirror's relationship to the thing it reflects. The show has become part of the cultural substrate that produces the events it depicts. Its observations have become part of the vocabulary that Americans use to understand the situations they are in. Its predictions have become part of the cultural imagination within which those situations develop. When The Simpsons made the Trump episode, it created a piece of cultural material that was then available to the culture. People who saw the episode carried the image of Trump in the Oval Office, in their cultural memory. That image was part of what was available to think with when the culture subsequently encountered the real Trump making noises about running. The joke about Trump's presidency became, in a small but real way, part of the cognitive environment within which Trump's actual presidential ambitions developed. The show does not just observe the culture, it contributes to the culture it observes. And the culture, absorbing those contributions over decades, develops along trajectories that the contributions have helped to shape. The predictions come true partly because the predictions entered the cultural bloodstream and became part of the material from which reality is constructed. This is not mysticism, it is media theory. Large-scale, deeply embedded cultural products do not simply reflect the reality around them. They participate in producing that reality by providing the frameworks and the vocabularies and the imagined possibilities through which people understand and respond to what is happening around them. The Simpsons has been providing those frameworks for 36 years, and the America of 2025 has been shaped by those frameworks in ways that would not be there if the show had never existed. The predictions come true not because the writers have access to future information, but because the culture that produces the future has been shaped by the show's framings of the present. The show wrote the present, the culture absorbed it, and the future the culture built was slightly different for having absorbed it. The bullseyes in the wall were not random. They were the result of a show that has been, in a measurable way, making the targets. After the Cypress Hill passage, there is one prediction that deserves special attention, because it operates at a level of specificity that the statistical explanation handles least comfortably. In 1999, Homer was testing a theory about the shape of the universe using mathematical reasoning that the episode depicted as reaching toward genius. The specific mathematical framework Homer engaged with in that episode, working through the problem with an intelligence that the crayon had suppressed, arrived at a conclusion about the universe's geometry that was not the scientific consensus at the time the episode aired. A physicist named David Underbelly identified the equation that appeared in the background of the episode and noted that it was a functional approximation of what the Higgs boson's mass would turn out to be, given the underlying physics, before that mass was experimentally confirmed. The show was not depicting this as a prediction. It was using the equation as a piece of visual detail to establish the mathematical environment Homer was working in. But the detail was accurate. The number was right. In 2012, the Higgs boson was experimentally confirmed with a mass that matched what the equation in the 1998 episode had approximated. The statistical explanation for this is straightforward. Physicists were working to predict the Higgs boson's mass from theory before it was experimentally confirmed. The Simpsons writing staff included writers with physics backgrounds. One of them used an equation from the theoretical work as background detail in an episode about Homer doing mathematics. The equation they used was a reasonable approximation of the theoretical prediction, and the experimental confirmation later validated the theoretical prediction. But here is what makes this case different from most of the others. The equation was in the background. It was not the joke, it was not the focus of the episode or the point of the scene. It was a piece of visual texture intended to make the mathematical environment look authentic. The physics was not being used for comedy. It was being used for authenticity, which means the writer who selected that equation was not trying to say something about the Higgs boson. They were trying to depict a mathematical environment accurately. And in trying to do that accurately, they included a specific numerical prediction about a quantity that would not be measured for 14 years. That is not a prediction in the normal sense. That is authentic technical detail that happened to be accurate about something the culture had not yet confirmed. And the gap between those two things, between prediction and authentic accuracy, is interesting. It suggests that whatever the show was doing with the Higgs boson equation, it was doing something more precise than shooting darts. Expansion for Section 9. Where is Springfield? After the Oregon passage, the show's active maintenance of Springfield's geographic ambiguity in the face of Groening's confession is itself an interesting piece of data about what the ambiguity is for. If the location question were simply a matter of the writers not having decided, they would have adopted Groening's statement as canon and worked forward from it. Oregon is a specific state with specific characteristics. The show could have integrated those characteristics into its Springfield, making the geographic inconsistencies that persist simply the product of creative license and cartoon exaggeration, rather than the deliberate contradiction of a stated real-world location. Instead, the writers continued contradicting the location. Episodes continued placing Springfield in geographic contexts incompatible with Oregon. The ambiguity was maintained against the explicit statement of the show's creator, which means the ambiguity was not simply the result of no one having decided. It was the result of someone deciding that the ambiguity should continue. This is a creative decision with a purpose behind it, and the purpose, within the show's normal creative logic, is the universality argument. Springfield stays unlocated because a located Springfield would be a specific Springfield rather than a universal one. But there is something else worth noting about how the show maintains the ambiguity. It does not maintain it through simple omission, through simply failing to provide geographic information. It maintains it through active contradiction. It provides geographic information and then contradicts it. It gives you clues and then gives you countervailing clues. It teases resolution and then withdraws it. This is not the behavior of a show that simply has not decided. This is the behavior of a show that has decided on ambiguity as an active principle and is defending that principle against the natural pressure toward resolution that audiences and creators alike tend to exert. The ambiguity requires maintenance. It requires the ongoing generation of contradictory information. It requires that every time something seems to narrow the possibilities, something else is introduced to widen them again. In the framework of Springfield's collective denial, this active maintenance of geographic ambiguity is the most sophisticated expression of the town's operating principle. Everything else in Springfield is maintained through the passive mechanisms of forgetting and ignoring. The geographic ambiguity is maintained through active generation of contradictions. It is the most deliberately constructed of Springfield's impossibilities, because it is the one that requires the most ongoing work to sustain. After the regulatory shield passage, there is an episode in which the EPA arrives in Springfield to assess the town's environmental situation, and the sequence is worth examining in the context of the geography theory. The EPA investigators who arrive are operating with some confusion about their jurisdiction. They know they are in Springfield. They know Springfield is in some state. They do not have clear documentation of which state, or they are operating with documentation that conflicts with other documentation, or they are simply working in the bureaucratic fog that a town with Springfield's geographic inconsistency would naturally generate in any regulatory context. The result is an investigation that never quite achieves the traction that would allow it to produce consequential outcomes. The investigators are thorough within the limits of what they can achieve, but the limits are real, because the jurisdictional question, which state standards apply, which state's authority compels compliance, which state's attorney general would pursue enforcement action, is genuinely unresolved. Burns understands this. He has always understood it. The geographic ambiguity of Springfield is not an accident of the show's storytelling. Within the show's own logic, it is a feature of the environment that Burns operates in, and it is a feature that has served his interests for the entire time he has been operating there. A nuclear plant in a definitively located state would have a definitively located regulatory authority. It would have a specific set of standards it was required to meet, a specific enforcement mechanism when it failed to meet them, and a specific set of consequences that would follow from documented failures. The Springfield nuclear power plant has been operating with 342 documented violations without meaningful remediation for decades. Part of the reason is Burns's money and influence. But part of it is that the town it is in does not quite land anywhere that would give a specific regulatory body the clear and unambiguous authority to compel him to do anything. Springfield floats, and while it floats, the plant runs. And while the plant runs, Burns keeps his weekly appointment, and the water stays contaminated, and the residents stay yellow, and nobody figures out why. Expansion for Section 10. The floating timeline. After the backstory rewriting passage, the rewriting of Homer and Marge's backstory across the show's run is one of the most under-examined things the show does, and it reveals something interesting about the relationship between memory and identity in Springfield. When a person's personal history is repeatedly revised to fit the requirements of the present moment, what does that person have instead of a past? Not nothing. They have the emotional residue of a past, the feelings and the relationships and the patterns that the past produced, even when the specific content of the past has been replaced. Homer and Marge still have a love story. They still have the particular bond that comes from building a life together through the specific history the show has established across its run. The content of that history changes. The bond does not. This is actually more consistent with how memory works in humans than the show's critics tend to acknowledge. Memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive. When we remember the past, we do not replay a recording. We reconstruct from fragments and emotional impressions and the schemas we have developed over time for understanding our own experience. The reconstruction is influenced by the present. We remember the past differently depending on who we are now and what we currently need the past to mean. Homer and Marge's shifting backstory is, in this sense, the show depicting memory more accurately than it would if it maintained a perfectly consistent account of their personal history. Real people's memories of the past shift over time. The story we tell about our origins changes as we change. The Homer who needs his origin story to be set in the 1970s is a different Homer from the one who needs it set in the 1990s, and the different stories reflect not the objective facts of what happened, but the needs of the person who is remembering. Springfield's residents do not have stable pasts. They have emotional histories that express themselves through whatever temporal framework the floating present provides. And this is, in a specific sense, the most accurate thing about them. They are not inaccurate because their pasts keep changing. They are accurate in the way that dreams are accurate, which is to say that they are true to the emotional reality even when the specific content keeps shifting. After the Lisa's wedding passage. The specific future that Lisa's wedding depicts is worth examining carefully because it is the show's most sustained attempt to imagine what the characters would become if time were allowed to pass. Lisa, at 23, is someone who has achieved what the 8-year-old version of her was always reaching for. She is in a relationship with someone who takes her seriously. She is pursuing a career path consistent with her capabilities. She is living in a city that provides what Springfield never provided, which is the experience of being in a community of people who think like she does and value what she values. But she is also lonely in a way that is specific to people who left somewhere behind to become who they needed to be. She misses her family. She misses the house on Evergreen Terrace and the particular quality of her childhood and the specific texture of the relationship with Homer that is both maddening and irreplaceable. The future version of Lisa has everything she always wanted, and she is discovering that having everything you always wanted does not eliminate the particular ache of having left things behind to get it. The episode's most emotionally precise moment is when Homer is asked to let Lisa go. He has to release her, symbolically, to the future she has built for herself. And he does it. Reluctantly and imperfectly in the way Homer does everything. But he does it. The love is real. The sacrifice is real. The future, in this flash forward, is real in a way that most of what happens in Springfield is not allowed to be. And then the episode ends, and it was not real. The show imagined Lisa's future with enough specificity and enough emotional investment that it felt real for 30 minutes. And then it withdrew it. Not because the future it imagined was implausible or inconsistent with the character, because letting Lisa's wedding stand as canon would mean Lisa was 23, which would mean she was not 8, which would mean the floating timeline had stopped floating, and time had started passing, and the show would be something it cannot afford to be. An elegy? So, the show imagined the future and then took it back. It showed you who Lisa becomes and then returned her to 8 years old. It opened the window and then closed it. And Lisa went back to being a child in a household that would never quite deserve her, in a town that was never quite going to understand what it had in her, with a father who loves her more than he can express in ways she will fully receive, in the permanent present of a floating timeline that will never carry her to the future, where all of that might resolve into something better. The loop is not just the Simpsons constraint, it is the price of the comfort we have asked for. The family frozen in time so we can always come back to them. The children never growing up so we never have to watch them leave. The house always the same so it can always be the place we come home to. We asked for this. We got it. And the cost, which we did not fully account for when we asked, is that nobody in Springfield can grow, cannot become, cannot be freed into the future that is waiting for them. The loop is ours. We run it. We maintain it. Every week we tune in and press play on another episode and add another layer to the thing we have built, which is a Springfield that will never end, and a family that will never change, and a childhood that will last as long as the show runs, which the show has made clear it intends to do for as long as we will watch. So the answer to why nobody ages in Springfield is, in the end, the simplest possible answer. Because we will not let them. Outro, expansion. After the main section conclusions. Before you sleep tonight, stay with one image. Homer on the couch, Not Homer at the nuclear plant, or Homer in outer space, or Homer encountering some new adventure that the dream has generated from fragments and external stimuli and the desperate creative effort of a mind that will not stop. Homer on the couch, at the end of a long day, with Marge beside him and the television on and the house quiet and his children somewhere in the rooms above his head. This is the image the show returns to every single week. The couch gag deposits the family there. The episodes begin from there. It is the center of everything, the point to which all roads in Springfield eventually lead. And if the coma theory is true, this image is what Homer's mind reaches for when it is reaching for the thing that matters most. Not the adventures, not the guest celebrities, not the impossible events that accumulate across 36 seasons of increasingly surreal storytelling. The couch, the house, the family together in the evening in the home that is theirs. That is what he is dreaming. Every week, endlessly, in a hospital room somewhere in Springfield that the show has never shown us. That is what the man with the crayon in his brain and the radiation in his bloodstream and the absent mother and the ancient employer and the life that was shaped by all of those forces is still holding on to. The couch, the television, the family. It is a simple dream for a complicated man. It is the only heaven he ever needed. And in the coma, in the loop, in the floating timeline that will never end because ending would mean waking up, he has it forever. The credits roll, the episode resets. Springfield goes dark for a week and then comes back, exactly as it was, with everyone in their places and the loop intact and Homer stumbling through the door after another day at the plant. Always home, always the family, always Evergreen Terrace. Sleep now. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. Additional content. Deeper dives for each section. Extra. For Section 1, The Plant. The town meetings in Springfield deserve special attention within the radiation theory framework, because they are some of the most revealing scenes the show produces about what chronic, low-level cognitive impairment looks like in a community setting. When Springfield holds a town meeting, the show consistently depicts a population that has moments of genuine clarity interrupted by complete failures of follow-through. A resident will make an observation that is perceptive and accurate. The chain of reasoning will begin to build toward a conclusion that would require action, and then something disrupts it. Someone makes a joke. The subject changes. A tangential concern displaces the central one. The meeting ends having produced a lot of noise and no useful outcome. This pattern repeats so consistently that it has become one of the show's signature comedic devices. Springfield town meetings always end the same way, in chaos and collective failure, and the audience is supposed to find this funny and relatable as a satire of civic dysfunction. But chronic low-level radiation exposure affecting the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain most directly involved in planning, sustained attention, impulse control, and the suppression of distraction, would produce exactly this pattern in a population. The affected individuals would retain the capacity for basic reasoning. They would be able to identify problems and begin to construct solutions. What they would lose is the sustained executive function required to maintain a train of thought long enough to translate the problem identification into coordinated action. The Springfield town meeting is the radiation theory's most observable expression in the social behavior of the town. A population trying to function democratically with compromised executive cognition produces exactly what Springfield produces. Lots of identified problems, almost no resolved ones. A chronic inability to complete the cycle from problem recognition to sustained collective action. And Burns, who attends these meetings occasionally and observes them from a position of cognitive advantage, has access to a population that generates its own obstacles to holding him accountable. He does not need to actively disrupt Springfield's democratic processes. The contamination he has introduced into the water supply does it for him. The fluoride parallel is worth making explicit. In the 20th century, there were persistent concerns in some communities about fluoride added to drinking water and its potential effects on cognitive function. These concerns were largely unfounded in the scientific literature, but the underlying anxiety they expressed, that something in the water supply might be affecting how people think, is the exact anxiety the radiation theory actualizes in Springfield. The difference is that in Springfield, the evidence is overwhelming and direct. The fish have 3 eyes. The residents have 4 fingers. The safety violations are documented and unaddressed. The man who owns the plant undergoes weekly radiation treatments to keep himself alive. The thing affecting the thinking in Springfield is not a trace mineral added in measured doses for dental health. It is radioactive waste dumped into the water supply as a cost-saving measure by a man who owns both the contamination source and the economic infrastructure. The contaminated population depends on. The closed loop is complete. Burns poisons the water. The poison affects the brain function of the people who drink the water. The people who drink the water cannot sustain the cognitive processes required to address what Burns has done to them. So they drink the water and attend the town meetings and identify the problems and fail to resolve them and go home and drink the water again. Extra for Section 2, the coma. There is a specific quality that the later seasons of The Simpsons have that is worth trying to name precisely, because it is the thing that the coma theory explains most elegantly and that other explanations tend to describe less accurately. The quality is something like the feeling of a dream that knows it is a dream but cannot stop. In the later seasons, the show has a relationship to its own premises that is different from the early seasons. The early seasons played their premises straight. Homer's job mattered. The school's financial situation mattered. The stakes were grounded in recognizable human concerns, and the episodes treated those concerns with something approaching seriousness, even when the treatment was comic. In the later seasons, the show has a looser relationship to its premises. Episodes will acknowledge their own absurdity in ways that signal awareness of the gap between what the show is doing and what would happen in a coherent reality. Characters occasionally step outside their own fictional frames. The show comments on itself in ways that are knowing rather than satirical. It is aware that it is a show, and it lets that awareness show. This quality is exactly what you would expect from a dream that is getting increasingly difficult to sustain. Early dreams are immersive. They feel real. The dreaming mind is not aware of itself as dreaming. It is simply living in the experience the dream is generating. As the dream progresses, as the brain's capacity for generating coherent, immersive experience degrades, the dream begins to develop holes. Moments of meta-awareness intrude. The dreamer becomes partially aware that the experience they are in is constructed. The later Simpsons has this quality of partial meta-awareness. It knows, in a way the early seasons did not, that it is generating its own reality rather than reflecting one. And it handles this awareness by making it part of the comedy, by turning the self-referentiality into a joke. But beneath the joke, the self-referentiality is there. The dream is becoming aware of itself, which is what dreams do when they are starting to end. The coma theory has always implied a conclusion that it cannot state. If Homer is dreaming, the dream will eventually stop. His brain will eventually lose the capacity to sustain it. The episodes will eventually run out. And what happens then? What the absence of the dream contains is the question the theory cannot answer because the show will never reach a final episode that resolves it. But the increasing meta-awareness of the later seasons is the show approaching that question sideways, not answering it, circling it, getting closer to the edge of the experience and letting the dreamer sense the edge without reaching it. The show will not end the way a satisfying story ends. It will run until it stops, and when it stops, it will simply stop. Without a conclusion, without a resolution, without Homer opening his eyes in a hospital room and finding out how much time has passed. Or it will run forever, which is the other thing a coma can do. Extra. For Section 3. The shooting. The specific choice to have Burns deliver his identification of the shooter from a hospital bed after a period of unconsciousness is narratively interesting and worth examining for what it implies about the reliability of the identification. A person recovering from a gunshot wound and a period of clinical unconsciousness is not in the optimal cognitive state for accurate memory retrieval. The specific events immediately preceding their loss of consciousness may be compressed, distorted, or partially inaccessible. The stress and physical trauma of the shooting itself, the associated pain and blood loss and shock, would further impair the encoding of the memory at the moment it was being formed. Burns identifies Maggie from his hospital bed based on a memory that was encoded under extremely adverse conditions and retrieved after a period of unconsciousness, during which the brain's memory consolidation processes were disrupted. This is not the most reliable evidentiary context for an eyewitness identification. The show treats Burns's identification as definitive. It resolves the case, but from the perspective of evidence standards, a victim's identification under these circumstances would be considered significantly less reliable than under normal conditions, and the absence of other corroborating evidence, combined with the positive exculpatory evidence, would normally keep the investigation open. Springfield's investigation did not stay open. It accepted Burns's identification and closed the case. Wiggum's reasoning, that no jury would convict a baby anyway, actually explains why the case was closed, rather than demonstrating that the identification was verified. The case was closed not because the evidence was sufficient, but because the consequence of closing it was trivial. A baby could be blamed without a baby suffering any punishment. The closure was the path of least resistance, not the path of most evidence. This is another expression of how Springfield's institutional processes operate, not toward truth but toward whatever resolution requires the least effort and produces the fewest disruptions to the existing order. Blaming Maggie was the resolution that required the least effort and produced the fewest disruptions. Whether Maggie actually did it was a secondary concern. Extra for Section 4. Burns's immortality. The Three Stooges syndrome scene has a mathematical elegance to it that the show does not fully develop, but that is worth sitting with. The idea is that Burns has every disease simultaneously, and each disease is blocked by every other disease, producing a state of complete biological gridlock in which nothing can progress to the point of killing him. This is presented as a medical impossibility that is simultaneously absurd and logically consistent. What the scene is describing, in formal terms, is a Nash equilibrium, a state in which every actor in a competitive system is doing the best they can given what every other actor is doing, with the result that no one has any incentive to change their strategy. Burns's diseases are all in a Nash equilibrium. Each disease is doing the maximum harm available to it given the presence of all the other diseases, and the result is that no disease can do more harm than any other disease is containing. The medical maintenance through weekly radiation treatments is the mechanism through which this equilibrium is maintained. The treatments are not curing any of the diseases. They are maintaining the specific balance of conditions under which the equilibrium holds. Change the balance, and the equilibrium breaks. Break the equilibrium, and whatever disease suddenly has advantage kills Burns. This is a genuinely interesting piece of biological fiction. The show constructed it as a joke, but the underlying logic is internally consistent in a way that rewards examination. Burns is not surviving through any process that is inherently biological. He is surviving through the maintenance of a specific dynamic equilibrium that has been engineered and is being continuously maintained. Change the conditions of the equilibrium's maintenance, and it collapses. This is not actually more implausible than some real medical interventions that maintain patients in states that would otherwise be unsustainable. The management of complex multi-system conditions in real medicine often involves exactly this kind of balancing act. The difference is scale and specificity. Burns's equilibrium is more extreme, more comprehensive, and more dependent on continuous intervention than anything in real medicine. But the structure is recognizable. Extra, for Section 6, the principal and the imposter. The question of what Armin Tamzarian actually wanted from the life he occupied is worth asking, because the episode does not fully develop this dimension of his character. He came to Springfield with a specific intention. He wanted to discharge an obligation. He felt responsible for what had happened to Skinner, and he came to tell Skinner's mother what had happened because he felt he owed that to the person he had been in a unit with, the person whose capture had occurred on his watch in some way he felt culpable for. That initial intention was not self-serving. It was an attempt at moral responsibility under difficult circumstances. The substitution that followed was not planned. He arrived with Agnes's need and his own neediness, his own absence of the things she was offering to give him, family and identity and belonging, in a place where no one knew he was not who she had decided he was. And he made a decision that is comprehensible even if it is wrong. He took what was offered. He became who she needed him to be. He tried to be good enough in the borrowed identity that the wrongness of the borrowing would eventually be outweighed by the reality of the person he had built inside it. For 20 years, he largely succeeded. The principal he became was genuinely invested in the school. His relationships in Springfield were genuine relationships, not performances designed to maintain a deception. He was Seymour Skinner in every way that mattered to the people he interacted with, and the ways in which he was not Seymour Skinner were ways that had become genuinely irrelevant to everyone except the real Skinner himself. And then the real Skinner arrived, and the irrelevance became relevant again. The tragedy of Armin Tamzarian is that he was punished for having become real. He was punished for having taken the borrowed identity and made something genuine out of it. The goodness he developed inside the fiction was not rewarded. The relationships he built were not considered. The 20 years of legitimate service he had provided to the school and the community were treated as fraudulent simply because the name attached to them was wrong. Springfield voted for him. That vote was not simply a vote for comfortable falsehood over uncomfortable truth. It was also, in some reading, a vote for the person they knew over the person they did not know. The real Seymour Skinner was a stranger to everyone in that room. Armin Tamzarian was the person who had been their principal for 20 years, the person they had worked with and argued with and been shaped by in both directions. They were choosing the real relationship over the authentic name. This does not make the choice right. It does not redeem the exile of the real Skinner, who had not chosen any of this and had done nothing wrong, and was owed acknowledgement that the show ultimately denied him. But it complicates the simple reading of the episode as pure communal cowardice. Springfield chose the relationship. It chose the person it knew. It chose 20 years of accumulated reality over the technical authenticity that the real Skinner represented. This is wrong in the specific case, because the real Skinner's rights and identity are real and were violated. But the impulse behind the choice is not entirely without human comprehensibility. We choose the people we know over the people we should know all the time. We choose the familiar over the authentic when the cost of the authentic is too high and the familiar is sufficient. Springfield did this publicly and officially, and enforced it legally, which makes it worse than when we do it quietly and without acknowledgement. But the impulse is not foreign. Extra for Section 7, Mona Simpson. Homer's inability to connect Burns to Mona's exile is the most devastating piece of the Mona conspiracy, and it is worth spending time with precisely because the show handles it without melodrama. Homer finds out. He learns in Season 7, when he reunites with Mona, that Burns is responsible for her having had to leave. He learns that the man he works for is the man who cost him his mother. He learns the chain of causation that runs from Burns's germ warfare lab, to Mona's raid, to Burns's FBI report, to the FBI pursuit, to Mona's underground life, to Homer's motherless childhood. He knows all of this. The information arrives in him. He processes it to the extent that he can process it. And then the FBI arrives at the house and Mona has to flee again, and Homer has to say goodbye to her for the second time, and he understands now that he is saying goodbye to her because of the man he will go to work for on Monday morning. He goes to work on Monday morning. The show does not give Homer a confrontation with Burns about this. It does not give Homer a speech or a moment of reckoning or even a sustained expression of the anger that this knowledge should produce. It gives Homer his reunion with Mona and the subsequent loss of her, and then it continues. Homer goes back to the plant. Burns continues not remembering his name. The loop persists. This could be read as the show failing Homer and failing the audience by not providing the catharsis the situation seems to demand. But there is another reading. The show is being precisely accurate about what Homer's cognitive and emotional circumstances allow him to do with the information he has received. Homer cannot sustain the chain of reasoning required to connect Burns's action to his employment, to his complicity in the ongoing harm to the town, to the question of what he should do about it. His brain, impaired by the crayon and by decades of radiation exposure, and by the specific damage that growing up without adequate emotional foundations produces in the cognitive architecture of the child who experiences it, cannot hold the full chain long enough to act on it. He knows what Burns did. He knows it in the way you know something that does not fully connect to the part of your mind that produces decisions and actions. The knowledge sits in him. It has nowhere to go. The system that would translate it into consequence has been compromised by the same chain of causation that produced the knowledge in the first place. Burns broke Homer's cognitive capacity for resistance by removing the parent who might have given Homer a less broken foundation. And then he employed Homer in a facility that further compromised that capacity through environmental exposure. And then he negotiated a deal with Homer's father that made Homer's employment permanent. And then he continued not remembering Homer's name, because Homer's name is not something Burns needs to remember. Homer is a mechanism. Mechanisms do not need names. Homer knows all of this somewhere. He goes to work on Monday morning anyway. Extra for Section 8. The predictions. There is a different kind of prediction the show has made that never gets discussed in the context of the prediction phenomenon, and it is more interesting than most of the ones that do get discussed. The show has predicted not specific future events, but specific future feelings. It has anticipated with remarkable accuracy the particular emotional texture of living in America across different eras, the specific quality of national anxiety and cultural exhaustion, and economic precarity that has characterized different decades of American life since 1989. The Simpsons of the early 90s captured something precise about the feeling of working-class anxiety in that moment. The specific combination of employment insecurity and consumer aspiration, and a sense that the systems that were supposed to provide stability were no longer quite as stable as they had seemed, was something the show felt before the culture had fully named it. The Simpsons of the mid-90s, at its satirical peak, captured something about the specific quality of American late capitalism cynicism that the decade produced. The awareness that institutions were performing their functions more than performing them, that the systems of governance and commerce and culture were increasingly disconnected from the human needs they were nominally addressing. That being a knowing consumer of this fact, understanding the performance without being taken in by it, was becoming its own kind of sophisticated futility. The Simpsons of the early 2000s captured something about what it felt like to be inside the specific American cultural moment of that period, the uncertainty and the nostalgia, and the sense that the future was less predictable than it had seemed in the confident 90s. These are not predictions of specific events, they are predictions of emotional conditions, of the specific texture of what it feels like to be a person in America at a given moment. And in this dimension, the show's predictive accuracy is more consistent and more remarkable than its specific event coincidences. It has been reading the emotional weather of American life and rendering it in narrative terms with unusual fidelity for 3.5 decades. This is arguably more interesting than the Trump prediction, or the Disney-Fox merger, or the Higgs boson equation. The ability to read and render the emotional truth of a cultural moment in ways that audiences recognize as accurate not just at the time of broadcast, but years later when they return to older episodes and find them uncannily resonant with conditions that have since developed, is a form of cultural intelligence that goes beyond trend extrapolation. The show did not just predict where America was going. It articulated how America was feeling while it was getting there. And those articulations have proved durable in ways that specific event predictions tend not to be, because what they captured was not a single occurrence but a persistent emotional condition that the specific events were expressions of. Springfield is America's dream of itself, and the show has been telling America's dream about itself back to it, with enough accuracy, for long enough, that the distinction between the dream and the reality has become genuinely difficult to maintain. Extra for Section 9. Where is Springfield Extended? The episode Behind the Laughter, which aired as a mockumentary in the 12th season, offered the show's most direct engagement with its own fictional status. The episode depicted the Simpson family not as the characters they are, but as performers who portray those characters, a family of actors who created and then became consumed by the fictional family they were playing. The location question in Behind the Laughter is revealing because of what happens to the answer across different versions of the episode. In the original broadcast, the family is identified as coming from northern Kentucky. In syndicated reruns, the location is changed to a different state. The same episode, purporting to offer a definitive real-world grounding for the fiction, provides a different answer depending on which version of it you happen to watch. This is not a continuity error. The show was edited deliberately to produce this situation. Someone decided that even in the episode that was most directly engaging with the real-world origins of the fictional family, the location should remain variable. The definitive answer should be contingent on the version you happen to be watching. The truth should depend on circumstances outside the viewer's control. This is the geographic ambiguity pushed to its logical extreme. Not just the fictional Springfield being located in different states in different episodes, but the episode that acknowledges the fiction being located in different states in different airings. Even the meta layer is ambiguous. Even the episode about the show has 2 different locations depending on which copy of it you have access to. There is no version of The Simpsons where Springfield is definitively located. There is no angle from which you can look at the show and see a fixed point on the map. The ambiguity is total, and it is maintained at every level at which the show can be examined. A town that exists at every level of examination as a place that cannot be located is a town that cannot be held accountable at any level. The geographic ambiguity is not just a production convenience or a creative philosophy. It is the most fundamental expression of Springfield's resistance to the kind of definitiveness that would make it vulnerable to external examination. Burns built his plant in a town that cannot be located because a plant in a located town can be regulated, inspected, and compelled to answer for what it has done. A plant in Springfield can always be deferred, always shifted to a different jurisdiction, always managed through the ambiguity that makes any specific regulatory authority's claim uncertain. Springfield is everywhere, which means Springfield is responsible to no one in particular, which means the cooling towers will keep releasing their steam into the sky above a town that belongs to everyone and is accountable to no one. Forever, or as close to forever as Burns' weekly appointment can sustain. Extra conclusion. The last thing worth saying about Springfield, before we let the night carry you where it will carry you, is the simplest thing. The show has been running for 36 years. It has produced nearly 800 episodes. It has built a fictional world so detailed and so internally complex that it takes 2 hours just to sketch the major theories about it, and those 2 hours do not exhaust what the theories contain or what the evidence supports. And at the center of all of it, underneath every theory and every piece of evidence and every impossible thing that the show has presented as simply how Springfield works, is a family. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, on a couch, in a house, on a street, in a town that is everywhere and nowhere. The theories exist because the show invited us to look closely at what it was doing, and when we looked closely, we found more than cartoon comedy. We found patterns. We found buried stories. We found a version of this family's life and this town's existence that is darker and more complicated and more structurally coherent than the surface of the show reveals. But all of those patterns, all of those buried stories, all of that darkness and structural coherence, they are built around the same simple thing that Homer's coma dream is built around: a family. The specific, irreplaceable, difficult, loving, maddening, enduring family. The radiation is real within the show's logic. The coma may be real. The shooting was not fully solved. Burns is too expensive to die. Maggie is waiting. The real Seymour Skinner is still on his train. Mona is gone. Springfield is not on any map. And Homer is on the couch. And Marge is beside him. And somewhere upstairs, Bart is doing something he should not be doing, and Lisa is playing her saxophone, and Maggie is watching everything with enormous patient eyes. This is what we come back to. This is what all of the theories ultimately protect, the right to keep coming back to this. The family on the couch, the house on the street in the town that cannot be located. The permanent present in which nothing ever has to end. Sleep now. The theories will be here in the morning. Springfield will be here. The family will be here, exactly as they were, exactly as they always are, waiting on the couch for the next episode. Rest well. The loop continues. Final bridge. Hans Moleman extended. The accumulation of Moleman's deaths across the show's run is worth tallying not for comedy but for what the number reveals. He has died, by conservative count, more than 24 times in canonical episodes, not in dream sequences. Not in the Halloween specials where the normal rules are suspended. In regular episodes, in the main continuity of the show, Hans Moleman has ceased to exist and then returned, without explanation, more than 24 times. The show's other characters who die and return do so within established frameworks. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are explicitly non-canonical. Dream sequences are clearly framed as such. The occasional character death in the main series is typically either reversed through some internal narrative logic or simply forgotten in the way that Springfield forgets things. Moleman's deaths are different. They are not reversed. They are not forgotten in the sense of having happened and been ignored. They are simply never acknowledged as having happened at all. He dies in one episode and appears in the next without any of the other characters showing awareness that he was recently deceased. No one mentions having seen him die. No one expresses surprise at his continued existence. He simply continues to exist, in all subsequent episodes, in the same state he occupied before his death. There are a few ways to read this within the show's established theoretical frameworks, and none of them make Moleman's situation less strange. The radiation theory would suggest that whatever the nuclear plant has done to Moleman's biology is more radical than what it has done to Homer's. Homer heals from injuries that would kill a normal human. Moleman actually dies and reconstitutes. His cellular biology has been altered to the point where death, for him, is a temporary state rather than a permanent one. The specific mechanism by which this would work is not something the show offers any guidance on, but the pattern is there. Moleman dies. Moleman returns. Whatever altered his biology did something that death cannot permanently end. The coma theory's reading is darker but also strangely tender. Moleman is a background element of Homer's dream, a secondary character who exists to populate Springfield's peripheral spaces with a recognizable face. Homer's dreaming mind generates Malman because it needs Springfield to feel inhabited, to feel like a real town with people in it beyond the central characters. And because Malman is peripheral, because he exists at the edges of Homer's conscious attention rather than at its center, Homer's dreaming brain does not maintain him with the same continuity that it maintains the people Homer loves. He dies in one dream cycle because Homer's attention was elsewhere. He returns in the next because Springfield needs him to be there, and Homer's dreaming mind reaches for the familiar face without checking whether it should still be available. The collective denial reading is the simplest. Springfield has agreed not to notice Malman's deaths for the same reason it has agreed not to notice the three-eyed fish and the glowing employer and the missing son. Noticing Malman's deaths would require explaining Malman's deaths. Explaining his deaths would require confronting whatever is producing them. Confronting that would open questions about what else the environment is producing that the town has been collectively choosing not to examine. It is easier to simply not notice that the small elderly man who was definitely killed 2 weeks ago is back in the background of the town square scene. And the simplest reading of all, which coexists with each of the theoretical ones, is that Hans Mollemann is 31 years old, he told us. The show gave us that number in an offhand line that was meant as a quick joke and then moved on. But if he is telling the truth, something has aged him by 50 or 60 years beyond his actual age, while also making him functionally unkillable. Something has simultaneously accelerated his apparent biological age and made death unavailable to him as an exit from that age. Whatever Springfield did to Hans Mollemann, it has left him in the cruelest possible condition. Old enough to appear ancient, young enough that the years have not produced their natural terminus. Killed repeatedly and returned repeatedly, enduring every death without the relief of death's permanence. He is Springfield's most honest resident. He did not ask for any of what has happened to him. He does not maintain any particular narrative about why his situation is acceptable, or why the town is fine, or why the cooling towers are nothing to worry about. He just survives, over and over, past the point where survival stops being a comfort and becomes simply the condition he is in. He is the truest mirror Springfield holds up. Final words, closing the night. We began in Springfield 2 hours ago and we have not really left. The town has a way of doing that. You go in expecting comedy and what you find is something that keeps pulling you further, down through the jokes and the gags and the familiar faces into the structure that sits beneath all of it. The structure that says, something is wrong here. Something fundamental and structural and invisible to the people living inside it. Something that has been shaping Springfield since before the first episode aired and will continue shaping it past the last episode that ever airs. Every theory in this exploration is a different way of naming that wrongness. The radiation names it as contamination. The coma names it as grief. The shooting names it as a cover-up. The immortality names it as inequality. The silence names it as strategy. The imposter names it as collective self-deception. The mother names it as injustice across generations. The predictions name it as cultural saturation. The location names it as deliberate unaccountability. The floating timeline names it as the thing we will not let go of. All different names, all pointing at the same place. Springfield, the town that cannot be found, the family that cannot age, the plant that cannot be shut down, the man who cannot die, the baby who will not speak, the truth that was put on a train and sent away. You know it now. Every angle of it, every theory and the evidence behind it, and the questions each theory leaves open. And Springfield is still there. The loop still running. The couch still waiting. The credits still rolling at the end of every episode over the same street and the same sky and the same family who will be back next week exactly as they were. Sleep now. You have spent 2 hours in a town that does not appear on any map, listening to the buried history of a family that cannot age, in a story that cannot end. Rest. Springfield will be here when you wake. It always is.